time, we'd like to welcome Logan Campbell.
All right. Thank you. Welcome. I am looking forward to spending the next 2.5, 3 hours or so with you guys and talking about drone data processing, specifically drone, Lidar, data acquisition and processing, and all of the other stuff that comes into that. To kind of start things off though, one of the things that I want to make sure that is clear is that I really like interactive presentations, talks, that sort of thing. The purpose of this, the purpose why I'm here is to actually try and educate you guys as much as I can on all of the stuff about drones, drone LiDAR, drone surveying that I know. But a big part of that is wanting to know what questions you have. So if you have questions, please do not hesitate. Raise your hand, throw something at me, whatever. I really like interacting with people, so please do ask questions. I really like it. As far as what we're going to cover today, we've got, honestly, a whole lot. I've got 3 hours to talk, and for better or worse, I actually really love this stuff, so I can talk for more than 3 hours, even though I'm sure you wouldn't want to listen to me for that long. But what I'm going to talk about today are the practical applications of a drone workflow, specifically covering 3 main categories today. First, we're going to be talking a lot about Lidar hardware. What drones are out there, what Lidar sensors, which ones we like, which ones we don't like quite so much, and what some of the trade-offs are. We're going to be talking then about data acquisition. That's everything to collect the data. How do you plan? What altitude do you fly? What GPS workflow do you use? And on and on and on. And then the data processing workflows as well. Once you have all of that data, how do you actually turn it into a survey? But one thing that I really want to emphasize on this slide is the practical applications of a drone workflow. And the reason I say that is because my focus for this whole group, for everything that I do, honestly, is not a science fair project. I'm not a guy that, tries to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and create this really cool looking, the best LiDAR system ever that no one will ever use because it's too expensive and hard to use. My goal is to actually make this practical, to actually make it something that you can use in your businesses repeatedly. So I have a huge focus on stuff that actually works repeatedly and regularly, not a one-time kind of science-y demonstration. A little bit about me. You already heard the intro, whatever. I have certifications and worked in the industry for a while, etc. About Aerotots and our company, what we do and the reason why we know all of this is we do drone data processing for land surveyors and civil engineers. I'm going to talk an awful lot about hardware. We're not like a hardware dealer or anything, but we get to see data from hundreds of different surveyors across the country and every different type of drone that's out there, so we actually can see which ones are successful, which ones work, which ones get used a lot, and which ones don't. This is what our company does, and that's why we do it. So I've already kind of said what our what we're going to cover, but my goal today, like I said, is to really help you all build a drone program, or at least learn what it takes to build a drone program that you will actually use. Like I said, practicality, not something that you buy because it's really cool. Honestly, I actually know a lot of people out there that buy drone programs because it's impressive to their clients to have the latest and greatest tech. That is not my goal today. My goal is to help you on a drone program that you will actually use. Secondly, one that actually saves you time. I do not want to tell you, here's how you do it, buy a drone program that will take 60 hours of work per week to just keep the drone in the air. Not a good use of your time, not a good use of your money, and then you wouldn't actually use it. And also one that gets better data. It's not just about throwing up a drone and getting pictures. Quite frankly, it's become so easy with this technology. You can buy a drone with GPS and autopilot for a couple of $100, which is awesome. But that's not going to get you survey quality data, and that's not going to replace your total station. Quite frankly, this won't replace your total station either, but it's a really good tool to have in addition to that. But these are kind of my goals today. I want to help you build a drone program that you will actually use, that actually saves you time and gets you better data. And one of the most important things about this is actually avoiding the pitfalls. And I'll be talking about that throughout. I'll be letting you know, kind of talking louder than I normally do. I know I'm a loud talker. I'll be talking a lot about the different pitfalls, the mistakes that we get to see all too often that people make that take what could be a really close, like a 95% there to being a successful, repeatable, useful drone program, and then all of a sudden something brings it down and takes up so much time and money that they don't use it. Things like not using the wrong tool for the job. Drones, LiDAR drones, photogrammetry drones are fantastic tools for surveying. They should not be used on every single job. In fact, I have a handful of slides about specific instances when you absolutely should not be using a drone because you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. It's a good tool. It is not the only tool. Not every drone is right, or not every job is right for a drone. Not every job is right for LiDAR. That's okay. So use the right tool for the job. I'll help you figure that out. Don't overspend on gear you don't need is another thing that we often see. People say, well, this LiDAR is good, but this LiDAR has 10 times as many points per second, so it clearly must be better. And that is very much not always the case. Going from a $50,000 drone to a $500,000 drone does not make it better. It's like trying to buy a Ferrari instead of a work truck. Ferrari's definitely a heck of a lot cooler, but it's not going to get you to the job site. Also, don't spend too much time in the office. You can collect all this beautiful data in the field and then waste away the time trying to process the data, and all of that time that you saved out in the field by flying a drone, you're going to spend twice as much time in the office. So get the data you need, get in, get out. That's really important as well as part of a good workflow. And lastly, I said this before, don't treat this like a research project. Quite frankly, it's the job of people like me to bang our heads against a brick wall, do the research projects, and figure out what worked and what didn't. I'm trying to help you so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, because there are good workflows for this. There are repeatable, reliable workflows for this. There are drones that work to get you the good data in the time you need and save time and money. You don't have to kind of figure this all out from scratch. I know a lot of you still probably will because you like to understand how things work. That's kind of how I work as well. But a good drone program, and what the goal of all this is to get you to that kind of repeatable, efficient, reliable workflow. Because at the end of the day, what you guys are trying to create and what I'm trying to help you create is a survey. Not a drone survey, a survey. And that means that you need to get the data that you need for your clients. In fact, very few clients say, hey, I need you to go out and fly with a Regal LiDAR sensor to get me topo. They say, no, they just want a topo survey. It's very often your job as the surveyor to say, okay, what's the right tool? What accuracy do you need? What's the land like? How much data is there to cover? You give them a price and then you take care of it yourself. I mean, that's how it ought to work. They're looking for a survey. And my goal is to help you get to that survey. And, huge amount of this you can look at and say, okay, well, how much of this was done with the drone? And the short answer is it doesn't actually matter to the end client as long as it's accurate enough, as long as it's good enough. The imagery was done by the drone, a lot of the mapping was done by the drone, the boundary would not have been done by the drone, a lot of underground utilities might not have been done by the drone, but you're going to blend it all together. That's what the end goal is. The end goal is to get you to a survey in the most accurate and cost-effective and time-efficient way possible. That's my goal. That's what I'm going to be trying to be talking about. And the reason I spend so much time up front with this is because you're going to hear that from me a lot, even repeated. Like, hey, this is the way that we recommend it. But wouldn't it be better if you could do X, Y, or Z? Well, yes, it might be better, but it takes so much time that it's not worth it. You don't need it to be better. So that's where I'm going. Any questions so far as we start to move into the actual meat of the whole thing? Awesome. Well, let's kick things off by talking about drone LiDAR hardware. Like I said, there are three parts to this. We're talking about hardware, field data collection, and then data processing. So starting with hardware. The first thing that I need to honestly cover is, okay, what is LiDAR, just to make sure we're all on the same page? Well, LiDAR is a laser, light, I forget this, I should know the acronym, what it stands for. But it sends out, with these modern day LiDAR sensors, hundreds of thousands of laser pulses per second, and it measures how long it takes the light pulse to go out and come back. It effectively measures distance from the sensor to whatever it's hitting, hundreds of thousands of times per second. It actually typically uses a wavelength that's invisible to the human eye. You can't see it. It actually can't hurt your eyes. Pretty cool. And it creates a raw point cloud that is uncolored. It's just this point cloud data. And everything else, all the coloration comes from post-processing, combining it with an image sensor, combining it all afterwards. LiDAR sensors actually work at night, which is pretty cool too, because they don't actually rely on any ambient light. They just send out those pulses and get data back. So LiDAR, why has it become so popular? Over the last couple of years, it's become hugely popular, both in land surveying and outside of land surveying, for quite a number of reasons actually. One of the things is a handful of high-profile technologies has made the general public available or aware of LiDAR. Where are all my photos? There we go. Things like self-driving cars are really big on LiDAR, and that actually has the other benefit of that's driven the costs down substantially. Anyone that did work with LiDAR, any sort of laser-based technology 4 or 5 years ago knew that it's hundreds of thousands of dollars, but because a lot of these tech companies have put so much money into automotive-based LiDAR, people have taken those sensors and started using them for surveying, and that's driven the cost down. People often like working with whatever the most cutting-edge technology is, willing to pay for it as well, but LiDAR does have some really unique advantages. For example, it's able to penetrate vegetation. This is from a project that was really, really popular a few years ago in the Central American rainforest that was done with some government entities in combination with National Geographic, and they did a survey over a couple 100,000 acres with what was honestly really low density LiDAR data by current day standards, but they discovered some cool new Mayan ruins and that sort of thing. It's gotten people really excited about the opportunities for it, and it's put in more investment that has actually brought the costs down over the last couple of years. But also, I mean, Apple started putting a LiDAR sensor in its iPhone, and some of the bigger iPhones recently too, which has gotten people aware of what LiDAR can do. More software information, like more software that people want to work with it. Now, can the iPhone do any sort of survey grade scanning? In my opinion, no. And can you strap it on a drone? Most definitely no. That's because it's a very different grade of LiDAR scanner. That one can only scan like, I think it's 10 feet or something, practically speaking, whereas a drone's gonna be flying at a couple 100 feet and still getting good quality data. Different ballgame, but it's still really cool to see LiDAR technology expand and go out everywhere. So why would you use LiDAR for surveying? Cool for self-driving cars, cool for a lot of things. Well, there are a couple of reasons why LiDAR is really beneficial for land surveying that some of you are probably aware of. The most important thing is that it can create topo data in vegetated areas. LiDAR has the ability to penetrate, and I'll discuss exactly what that means in a second, to penetrate vegetation and actually still get good ground data even when it is covered in trees and plants and shrubs and bushes and that sort of thing. LiDAR is also very exceptionally useful in a good way for power line mapping. If you ever do power line corridors, you need to map the poles, the attachment points, power lines, anything like that. It's very cool. And also because expensive technology is impressive. Like I said, I kind of used to discount it a lot more. Like, well, don't buy it just because it's really impressive, but the more I see it, the more I work in this industry, the more I see how many people want to just be on the cutting edge. Regardless of whether or not they're actually making money on it, they want to make sure they don't fall behind. And that's honestly not that terrible of a reason. My focus is to actually also make you money on it too, but it is really impressive. However, for most projects, photogrammetry, that would be drone surveying and mapping with just pictures, no LiDAR, is actually still cheaper and more accurate. And I'll show you the data to back that up later. And that's going to be something that's part of this how to pick the right tool for the job and how to make money. LiDAR is not right for every project. If you're doing power lines, yes, absolutely LiDAR is the right tool for the job. If you are doing any sort of topo or surveying on areas that have significant amounts of vegetation, tree coverage, woods, any sort of streams or rivers or anything like that, yep, LiDAR is absolutely great. If you are doing an Alta survey on a parking lot, LiDAR is probably not going to be the right tool for the job. It's going to take a lot more time, a bigger, more expensive drone, and capture a lot of data that's hard to process, and it's not going to be any better than photogrammetry. In fact, when you are flying a drone, very often, in most cases still, the photogrammetry-derived data will be more accurate than the LiDAR-derived data. When you have both of them with everything else equal, same drone, same flight altitude, taking photos and LiDAR data, the photogrammetry data is very often going to be more accurate. So I was talking about vegetation penetration, and this is important to understand of how vegetation penetration works. Well, it comes from a part of the laser that is shining through the gaps in the leaves. There's a common misconception that LiDAR is actually able to penetrate through leaves, through trees, or through vegetation because the wavelength can go through certain amounts of things. That's actually not the case. The way that it works is that it shines through, and it kind of shines, if you imagine like a cone of light, and if just one little bit of that can actually get through any gap in the leaves, then it can see through that and pick that part out from the end. And that's what's called, when it's talking about multiple returns. It shines this light down, it'll hit the branches at multiple places on the tree before hitting the ground, and that last return is typically going to be the ground. That means for any one pulse, at least in this image, it can take 4 different returns, 4 different elevations that it will put 4 different points in the point cloud before finding the ground. Now, how do we actually figure out which one's the ground and which ones are the leaves? That's what we're talking about at the end of the presentation, which is the processing. But it's important to note that the laser doesn't actually penetrate the trees, but it can often see through gaps. It doesn't take much. For example, this, if you can see the sky above, if you can see the light coming through, LiDAR will work. But it's not perfect. That means for a lot of, well, honestly, like real dense jungly areas, I know there are a lot of places in like Florida where you have huge dense rainforest practically, LiDAR still is going to have a lot more trouble penetrating it. It's going to be way better than pretty much anything else out there, but it's not going to be absolutely perfect. It's not like you get every single centimeter of a ground no matter how much vegetation. A lot of different shrubs, things that are really, really dense, are problems. But also, standard LiDAR can't penetrate through things like water or things like snow. It's a common thing, oh, can I just use LiDAR to go through, see the ground under snow? Nope, same thing with underwater. Yes, there are specialized LiDAR sensors out there that are capable of doing aerial bathymetric LiDAR. Those are extremely rare, extremely expensive, and I would argue still in kind of the research phase. I know they're out there, but those are not really what we're talking about today because it requires a fundamentally different laser technology in order to get any sort of depth measurements in water situations. So most drone LiDAR as it exists today does not penetrate water, snow, or anything like that. All good on kind of the fundamentals of LiDAR so far? All right. The other thing that's worth knowing as we talk about Lidar hardware, before we even get into the different manufacturers that are out there, the different types of sensors in drones, we've got to acknowledge that Lidar systems are actually really complex to make everything work together. Now granted, a lot of things are complex. Your cell phone is really complex with all the different chips, but they make it work simply. LiDAR's a lot newer technology than cell phones are, and that means a lot of this complexity you kind of have to deal with when you're putting it together. And when you're buying it and starting to work with it. For starters, there's what is often called the payload, which is going to be the LiDAR part that includes the actual laser sensor itself. And the laser sensor itself, it's worth noting, is kind of a fairly dumb tool. All it does, it's like a laser, it sends points. It needs to be combined with things like the IMU, an inertial measurement unit that knows where the laser is pointing. It needs to be combined with a camera that actually takes photos along with it. That's what adds the colorization to the point cloud so that the point cloud actually looks like the real world. It needs to have a gimbal, or doesn't necessarily need it, but that really helps to stabilize the imagery, to stabilize the LiDAR, to put it all together. And that's just the payload. That needs to be strapped on top of a drone, an aircraft. So that means the drone itself. It means it needs to be integrated with the GPS or GNSS. I'll use those interchangeably, even though I know they're technically not. And then it needs a flight computer to actually put all of that together to make sure that it's sending the LiDAR pulses out at the right time, it's receiving them, it's connecting those to the IMU, to the GPS system, to the camera with the right timestamps so that when you get into post-processing at the end, it is all nice and easy. When this works, it is a beautifully, fascinatingly simple system, and it's nice when it works, but it doesn't always, because putting all of this together is really complex. And that's even before you integrate the ground systems, which means you actually need your ground station or controller, what's actually driving the autopilot, telling it when and where to fly, as well as your GPS-based station, whether you're using one that's directly tied to the drone, or a Trimble one, and you're PPK processing it, or you're RTK processing it, or you're connecting to a network RTK. There are so many different workflows out there as well to combine all of this data. Now, here, these are like the basic systems, and quite frankly, when they all work together, like I said, it's really simple, but they don't always. And this is one of the biggest pitfalls that I was talking about earlier, is the systems where putting it all together doesn't quite work the way that you want it to. Where a lot of systems that are out there are the best laser that's out there, a really nice, military grade IMU, a huge, awesome, fantastic drone that's out there. You've got the best Trimble systems in the world. You've got all kinds of extra, $30,000 computers to process everything. And you process it and the data just doesn't quite come out right. And you're not sure why. And so you start going into troubleshooting, and you check your flight logs, and you check your timestamps, and you check what epoch your GPS was set to, and all of these other things, and it just becomes a pain in the butt. And it's not that you can't get it to work, because quite frankly, most surveyors are pretty good at working with a lot of these hardware types and troubleshooting these problems. It's not that you can't get it to work, it's that it takes an awful lot of time, and it's kind of a pain when you start putting all of these complex systems together, especially when each piece individually is the best piece that money can buy, and then you put it all together and the workflow starts to become a problem. That's the most common problem that we see in LiDAR, is not when you don't buy the right hardware or when the hardware isn't good enough, it's when the workflow isn't good enough, and there are so many different stumbling blocks that putting all of this complex data together is the problem. There are also limitations to aerial LiDAR. I think I already covered some of these. Yeah, it can't penetrate things like snow, water. As I mentioned, another thing that's very important to note is that the accuracy of aerial LiDAR is not as good as ground-based LiDAR. Now, everyone says, well, a LiDAR sensor, I use my total stationer, I have a ground-based scanner that, you can measure absolutely every blade of grass perfectly. Yes, well, that's typically with a scanner that's on the ground, on a tripod, and anywhere from 5 to maybe 50 feet away from the target that it's measuring. If you take that same LiDAR sensor, slap it on a drone where it's moving at 30 feet per second, it's buffeting around in the wind, tilting, kicking, and it's flying anywhere from 200 to 400 feet above its target, and often flying at an angle, so the effective laser beam distance is anywhere from 500 to 600 feet. Well, all of a sudden, even though it's the same quality laser as your ground-based LiDAR, it's not going to look quite as nice as your ground-based or terrestrial-based LiDAR. Which means if you're used to working with ground-based LiDAR and you see a curve, and a curve is an absolute perfect sharp line, and then you see an aerial LiDAR or any drone-based LiDAR, and you actually see, no, there's some fuzz to it. It basically takes, all curves become rounded curves when you're dealing with drone data. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the post-processing, because with a good workflow, a good drafting technician can take those rounded curves and actually draw the proper lines on it, and that's what you really should do. So yes, you can get curve lines from this, but if anyone buys an aerial LiDAR and is expecting to see the level of clarity and sharpness that you get from ground-based LiDAR, you're probably going to be disappointed. But if you don't have that preconception, then you're going to be really impressed with what aerial LiDAR can do. It is also worth noting that one of the limitations with LiDAR is that the field operations are much more complex than with photogrammetry. Right now, kind of the gold standard of the photogrammetry drones for new ones is what's called the Mavic 3 Enterprise RTK. It's a DJI one. This thing's tiny. I mean, it could fit in a briefcase absolutely no problem with all of its batteries. And that can get easily survey-grade mapping done with photogrammetry. Whereas the smallest LiDAR drones are typically going to require 2 or 3 very large 50-pound cases. The batteries are so big that they require their own case and everything. It's a very different field workflow. Again, that photogrammetry LiDAR trade-off, the cost of photogrammetry drones has gone down so much for survey quality and RTK-enabled photogrammetry. Yeah, but then those are some of the limitations. That's kind of how LiDAR works. But one of the things that most people want to know is, well, okay, what hardware do I buy? What are your hardware recommendations? And I'll happily, that's where we're going to walk through what some of these are. So just show of hands, how many people actually have or their company has a LiDAR drone right now? Okay, so we got a few. And we'll probably see a lot of these things. When we're talking about hardware, I think the right methodology to picking hardware actually requires a balance of 3 different things. This is how we look at hardware. Number 1 is ease and reliability of use. I've talked about this before. That's with that kind of what I was talking about with this complex system, right? That if it's way too complex, then it's not easy to use and it's not reliable. And when I say reliability, a lot of people first think, well, if you say a drone isn't reliable, does that mean it's going to come out and crash? No, it doesn't mean it's going to crash. Drones, the autopilots, from a safety perspective, have become so unbelievably safe that drones really don't crash. There are some exceptions, whatever, but they basically don't crash. So when I talk about reliability, it's not that the propeller's going to go flying off or anything like that. It's that some tiny thing might go wrong. And these are the mistakes we see all the time, ranging from the old, you left the lens cover on the camera because you didn't have a live video feed through the camera, so you didn't realize you left the lens cover on, so you flew a job and you didn't get any data, or you got 5,000 pictures of the back of the lens cover. That's not a reliable workflow if your system can allow that to happen. Or in the post-processing where there was a time offset between the LiDAR and the drone in the base station, and all of a sudden the actual LiDAR data compared with the GPS data is offset by 0.2 of a second, and it winds up making your entire point cloud noisy. That's an unreliable workflow. Even though you can fix a problem like that with post-processing, that is an unreliable workflow, and that is not an easy workflow. The other thing is, who's going to actually fly this when we talk about ease and reliability of use? I really like systems that don't require 3 days of specialized training in order to fly the drone. I'm a big fan of systems where I can teach an intern how to fly a drone in 2 minutes and not actually worry about it. Go out, turn it on, press go. That's kind of where you want to be with ease and reliability of use. Accuracy of the final data is the next thing that we're going to talk about. And I say accuracy of the final data because that's what I really care about, not accuracy of the laser by itself, not accuracy of the IMU by itself, not accuracy of the GPS system by itself, the accuracy of all of those things when put together. I find it a little frustrating sometimes when I see hardware companies pushing LiDAR and the spec sheet is like, our laser is accurate to 3/1,000,000th of a foot. Well, sure, that's cool that your laser on a table in a laboratory is accurate to 3/1,000,000th of a foot, but that means absolutely nothing because once you strap it to a drone and put in all of the noise and buzzing and errors in the real world, that means very, very little. So the accuracy of the final data is important. However, it is not the only thing. This is one of 3 different pillars to this stool. In my opinion, the final data needs to be good enough, not perfect. Because perfect, if you want absolutely perfect data, well, it's going to be really, really, really expensive. It's something that I hear a lot from clients. I say, okay, what kind of accuracy do you need on this project? And they say, I want as good as you possibly can get. And then I say, well, here's what the cost is going to be for the best that you can possibly get. And they say, I don't want the best accuracy anymore. That's too much money. So accuracy of the final data, making it good enough, but also not making sure that that's not the only thing you talk about. Because also involved in this is the total cost of ownership of the drone. And that itself is a couple of different things. That means the cost of the equipment itself matters, whether it's a $40,000 LiDAR system or a $400,000 LiDAR system. The cost of operation, how many people does it take? How difficult is it to transfer the equipment? How many employees do you have that can actually work and fly the drone itself? And how much time does it take them in the field to actually set up and fly? Is setup a 2-hour process or is it a 5-minute process? The cost of that really matters in making this a repeatable, useful thing. As well as the cost of data processing. Not all LiDAR systems will have the same data. Some are very smooth data processing workflows, some are much more complex. You have to think about the total cost of all of these things and balancing all 3 of these things when you're actually buying a drone in terms of what drone you use. All right, I told you I'd call out pitfalls, right? Is this obvious enough? The most common hardware pitfall that I would say is do not, under any circumstances, ever buy a drone, especially a LiDAR drone, based purely on the tech specs. This happens all the time, and it breaks my heart, because people will buy the drones based only on the spec sheet that they see. Ooh, this drone has 600,000 pulses per second, and the other one only has 400,000 per second. That means this drone is 200,000 better, or something like that. I can tell you, with drone LiDAR today, the pulse rate is almost completely insignificant, because these drones are all capable, not all, 90% of the drones out there are good enough and will bury you in data to the point where adding more pulses with a better sensor is a huge problem, and it actually makes it worse. And if you don't have that workflow side down, if you don't have that reliable process down, then all of a sudden you just spent twice as much money for something you're going to use a quarter as much. And it's just, please don't buy a drone based purely on the tech specs. Take into account the other factors. We see this all the time, and it's a real bummer to me because it is this, people buy these really cool technologies without actually worrying about how easy they are to use, and how they can actually be used in business. And this goes back to what I said, my focus is something that you guys can actually use. My goal is not to just say, hey, here's the latest and greatest thing that NASA's JPL got to work on Mars, although I'm a nerd, I like that stuff, and I think it's really cool that there actually is a LiDAR drone on Mars right now. But that's not the one you want, because that's a $10 million drone that's sitting on Mars, and it takes something like 100 PhD students to operate it. So please don't buy a drone based purely on the tech specs. Balance it with all of the different factors before you actually pick the right LiDAR one. All right, let's get into some actual companies, some actual drones. I've been talking a lot about principles, and now we can actually start talking about the hardware itself. Generally speaking, when it comes to all drone hardware, whether it's LiDAR or otherwise, there are two main categories. There's DJI, which is overwhelmingly the market leader, and then there's everyone else. Those are the two different drone categories. DJI is I don't know what their LiDAR market share is. I think it's probably about 60 or 70%. But generally speaking, the benefits of DJI is that it has one of the simplest workflows. It's all made by the same company. It is relatively cheap. A DJI L1, which is their primary LiDAR drone, costs about $35,000, $36,000 all in. Expensive, but not insane for LiDAR. So it's relatively cheap. It is very easy to use as well, and it has good, but not the best, accuracy. And the downsides of it are that, one, that it is Chinese made, which a lot of people don't like, understandably. They typically have very poor hardware support too, so you kind of need to work with a dealer or someone to actually help make sure you get your hardware support, you can get the right parts, etc. And it's also not going to be the absolute bleeding edge technology. If you're looking for that thing that's a showpiece that's going to be the most expensive drone out there, DJI is probably not going to be the best bet. You buy them because they're simple, relatively cheap, easy to use, and good enough. They're very, very smooth workflows, not the best hardware out there. The everyone else category, of which there are a lot, no one has a clear second position in this, are going to often be a lot more specialized to your needs. That means they are going to be very survey-oriented. They'll have typically higher quality components. They're often made, at least in part in the USA. A lot of them actually still fly American-made LiDAR sensors on DJI drones themselves, because the aircraft that DJI makes is just so reliable and ubiquitous. They typically will have better hardware support from your dealers or from the manufacturers. Not always, because unfortunately a lot of these companies have gone bankrupt and then don't support their hardware anymore because they don't exist. And they are going to be your very, very cutting edge technology with, like I said, the downside is typically that these other companies often have much more complex and unreliable workflows. And again, I say unreliable because it's not that, something breaks or it's just cheaply made or anything. It's that it's so complicated that it opens up the door for a lot of human error. And I say that as someone that has made a lot of human error myself, and honestly, you guys probably have in your career too. Whether you go out to the field and you either forgot to charge batteries or bring GPS antennas, or left something at home, or locked your keys in the car or something, right? You don't want to open up the door to making mistakes like that. These are also typically going to be more expensive than the DJI equivalents, depending on the drones, anywhere from 50% or more expensive than a DJI equivalent, and usually requires specialized training because it is going to be custom flight controller software, custom post-processing stuff that you have to import everything to run PPK, etc., etc., etc. The most popular non-DJI systems and components, these are the ones that people really want to know about. First of all, there are the LiDAR sensors, which are separate from the system integrators or the companies that put them together. LiDAR sensors come from companies like Velodyne, Regal, Livox, and Quanergy. The reason I say that is because you will likely never be buying from these guys directly. They are kind of the component manufacturers that then feed into the system integrators that actually build the drones and put it all together. The four most popular ones right now are going to be GeoQ, Rock Robotics, Microdrones, and Lidar USA. They all make, some of them are better in ways than others, but these are the systems that we see most commonly out there that are going to have those kind of, they're the everyone else categories, like I say, the most popular non-DJI ones. Recently I'd say GeoQ is probably the most popular one. I like them, but they are not without some of those kind of unreliable field workflows as well that just make it a little bit tricky. Any question on Lidar hardware out there? I know we got a lot of people that have Lidar or maybe are thinking of looking at it. No questions? I need more excuses to drink coffee. Maybe give coffee to you guys too. So these are the systems out there. Like I said, they work. I don't love them because of that unreliable field workflow thing. Because sometimes we'll get data back from them and, you know, multiple LiDAR swaths are just, you know, it flies down, flies back, and they'll be offset by a foot within the same flight, which really shouldn't be happening if you got your GPS processing correct. So it might be a GPS error, but they're all very black boxy. But these are the most popular non-DJI systems and components that are out there. Like I've said before, making drone LiDAR work reliably being a key word, can be very complicated and expensive because you do need to combine so many different components. You need to actually buy the hardware and components, you need an integrator to put them all together, you need an operator that knows how to fly it, and then you need to run data processing across multiple specialties. Multiple specialties often being anywhere from flight planning and photogrammetry to GNSS processing for your person that knows how to get your Opus solutions on the base station and then put it through and actually run your PPK processing across the drone itself, all the way through to your data extraction, point cloud processing, point cloud thinning, and automatic ground classification algorithms. And the reason why, again, making it work reliably is so tricky is when you find a problem, especially if you only find a problem at the end, everyone wants to point the finger at everyone else and say, it's not my fault, it's that guy's fault. The hardware guy says, no, you just processed the GPS wrong. The GPS guy's like, no, the hardware broke or something there's wrong like that with the gimbal lever arm offset is wrong. And everyone points their finger at everyone else and it becomes a mess. I'm sure you guys have seen it before, I've seen it a lot too. It's why I don't love these kind of, well, quite frankly, the systems that look a lot like this, that are going to be very complex with all kinds of plugs and hooks and stuff hanging out. So the DJI L1, which was out, it was released I think just over a year ago now, just about a year ago, has really changed the drone LiDAR landscape. The DJI L1 sensor is the one that mounts to the M300. It's their LiDAR and photogrammetry blended payload sensor. It is, so like I said, it's a LiDAR sensor, it's actually a LiVox sensor, that is combined with a 20 megapixel mechanical shutter camera that can get you, in our real world testing, usually at or better than 0.2 of a foot vertical accuracy with the LiDAR, and 1/10 of a foot vertical accuracy with the photogrammetry on hardscape. Now again, this is some of the data that I was mentioning before, that on hardscape, photogrammetry is still more accurate than LiDAR. LiDAR is a little less accurate, but it can work in extremely dense vegetated woods, forests, things like that.
That 40,000, that's everything altogether, right?
That's everything, and actually I should have updated this a couple of weeks ago. They dropped the price, it's 35,000. So the way that it works, roughly speaking, is the LiDAR sensor is that L1 sensor. I want to say it's a little bit under 10 grand, like 8 or 9 or something. If you're interested, shoot me an email and I can give you the exact prices because I forget them off the top of my head. The drone is like 15 grand, and then there's another 10 grand of cases, batteries, base stations, GPS, etc., etc., etc. So 35, 36 is about your all-in cost for a DJI L1 LiDAR system. And I say all in, if you are really trying to cut corners, there are absolutely ways you can get it for an awful lot cheaper, but I don't often recommend those because then they don't work so well. because I don't like people that try and save $5,000 and then all of a sudden end up with a $30,000 paperweight. That's my goal. So this is the L1 sensor. It's overwhelmingly the most popular LiDAR sensor out there. For anyone that actually really likes the tech specs on the sensor, DJI doesn't really advertise it, but it uses what's called a Livox Avia sensor. This is the, like I said, Livox, Quanergy, Velodyne, and Regal are the big ones that actually make the underlying sensor, and then DJI is kind of the system integrator that puts it all together. In fact, some of those other third-party sensors, or third-party drone manufacturers, use the exact same sensor. This one's kind of the color and shape of that little green cube is something that's kind of a giveaway for this one if it's using the same actual underlying LiDAR sensor as the DJI one. But yeah, here's your point rate, 240,000 points per second, which again doesn't matter because it takes so much more data than you need. In fact, if you start flying this, especially at like low altitudes, you can get thousands of LiDAR points per square foot. Like the density is ridiculously good. It is not the limiting factor. Don't buy based off of this. A lot of these different precisions to 2 centimeters and whatnot. Are you going to survey with 2 centimeters of accuracy? Absolutely not. No. Your real world accuracy is going to be on the order of 1 to 2 tenths of a foot for LiDAR data. We can often get better than that, but realistically, for topo LiDAR data, you're looking at 1 to 2 tenths of a foot. And that is actually very, very similar with all of the non-DJI drones too. Some of them, their end accuracy is slightly better, but not game-changingly so. And at the cost of a lot more money and a lot more complex of a field workflow. So that's the DJI L1, which actually is what we have found to be the most reliable LiDAR system out there. It's what we recommend, purely based, not purely, but primarily based on that workflow. So that means the DJI M300, which is the drone that it works on, the L1 sensor. In fact, it's worth noting that I talk about LiDAR and photogrammetry. The sensor on here is capable of LiDAR and photogrammetry, and in projects where you don't need LiDAR, you still can and should fly exactly this drone and fly it just in photogrammetry mode. Don't collect the LiDAR data, you really don't need it. It doesn't add any benefit when you're doing a photogrammetry only project. This is, if anyone's very familiar with drones, it actually is effectively the same image sensor as the Phantom 4 RTK and the Mavic 3 Enterprise RTK, the M3E. There are some very, very minor differences but are negligible for all practical purposes. That is a workhorse photogrammetry sensor that's used in all kinds of different things. Yeah?
I've heard people mention DJI and Chinese-made products not being allowed on, like, say, a client site or something like that. Have you seen that, or is that true, or is that a growing thing at all that you deal with?
Yeah, it's often with government sites. So if your entire job is working for the Department of Defense, then you probably can't buy a DJI drone, and you'll need to go with one of the other ones. And I say one of the other ones, you'll need to actually even be careful, because like I mentioned, many of those still use DJI drones and then just attach a non-DJI payload to it. The number of ones that are actually fully American-made and Department of Defense compliant are rare and very expensive. You're paying a lot to get, full Department of Defense compliance on a LiDAR drone. They exist, but they're going to be considerably more expensive, and the operational costs are going to be a heck of a lot more expensive as well. Now, that is primarily, like I said, for actual federally owned, federally operated things. I've heard of a few other companies that say, we can, we want to, we don't want to use DJI. In general, what I've seen, I really wish there were an alternative to a DJI drone. I wish that I could say that this is, the Apple one or something, but those are all made in China too. But really, this is just the most common. This is the one that we see that surveyors are actually most successful with. And now, I'm not trying to throw you or your purchasing guys under the bus if someone bought a drone that isn't the DJI L1, because there are plenty of companies out there that are very successful with non-DJI drones, but typically that's because they have a drone operator and a drone guy that is very capable and really loves the tech to be able to work through some of those more complex, more challenging field workflows. We like the L1 because you don't need to have a absolute pro, multiple years of experience flying drone guys to fly it. But yeah, as far as, you know, the Chinese made stuff, there's not a ton of options, and unless you're really forced to by a client that is willing to pay for it, then this is really the best game in town. Any other hardware questions before we keep moving on? Yeah.
So there's an L1, there's an L2 sensor, right?
Not yet.
Okay.
Maybe eventually.
But there is one that might be better, right?
Not for this drone and not made by DJI.
Okay.
The L1 is their first LiDAR sensor. So as far as guessing where DJI is gonna go, first of all, you can't take the numbers to mean too much. They've gone from they started with a Matrice 100 and then went to a 600 and then a 210 and then the 300 is the most recent drone. And if that order makes no sense, you're correct. I don't know why they do it. Same thing with like the Mavic 3, which was the Mavic M3E Enterprise RTK, was effectively the successor to the Phantom 4 RTK. So it kind of went backwards in number, but their naming conventions are absurd. It drives me nuts. But yeah, will there eventually be an L2 sensor? Probably. However, as a company that follows a lot of the supply chains, a lot of the technological advancements, we're looking a couple years out, probably. This is not a annual refresh iPhone style that this was a year old so that the L2 is gonna come out this year. No, absolutely no indications that this one's gonna be replaced for at least a couple of years. Any other hardware questions in my last chance of hardware before we actually dive into the data processing? Yeah, what's up?
To your knowledge, the domestic LiDAR sensors, do they require their own specialized software for processing, kind of like DJI Terra is required for the L1?
Yes, great question. Not for the entire workflow, and this is, I'll cover this afterwards, but the first step of the workflow to go from the raw sensor data to actually a usable point cloud, like even an unprocessed point cloud, no classification, just from the raw data to a point cloud, requires proprietary technology, proprietary software for pretty much everyone. And that's going to be usually given by these system integrators. So like GeoQ has their own LP360, DJI has their DJI Terra, blah, blah, blah. But yes, they do require their own, different people call it different things. I kind of call it pre-processing software, where you're actually combining that IMU data, the GPS data, the camera data, putting it all together to get your point cloud from it.
So we have several drone certified FAA flyers. It's my understanding if you fly commercially, you have to get it FAA certified, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's called an FAA Part 107 certification. You gotta go in and take a test, and that's about it. FAA Part 107 certifications are pretty easy to get nowadays. You do have to study for them, but there are a lot of online videos where you can just watch a couple hours of videos, go in, sit for a test, and then you get a license for a couple of years. The FAA has done actually a reasonably good job at making those easy to get, your FAA certifications. It's worth noting on the cert, for anyone that is afraid of them, they don't actually test any knowledge about how to fly a drone or operate a drone at all. The only thing the FAA cares about is that you don't interfere with manned aircraft, pretty much. That is basically the whole test is, hey, how do you not crash into an airliner, and be aware that if you crash into an airliner, you're gonna get in a lot of trouble. That's basically what the test is. A little bit more than that. But no, the FAA 107 certification is very easy to get nowadays if you study for it. The FAA has also done a great job in opening up airspace so that you can fly in many, many places. Something like 98% of the United States is in fully uncontrolled airspace. You can fly a drone without any additional paperwork or permits whatsoever. And then as you get closer to like airports or federal prison facilities, you just need to file a little bit of paperwork sometimes to actually get it done. We've helped our customers fly literally on airport properties doing airport surveys, or one of my favorite ones was actually, it was a federal prison where they wanted to fly, and it was fully restricted flight area, and we had to file paperwork because you can't bring a survey rod and nails into a prison. You can't drive a nail because that's a weapon. So they're like, whatever we can do to fly the drone, I don't care if it takes a month. But that was a very interesting project. That was O.J. Simpson's home when he lived there. So that's our recommended setup for surveyors. Any other hardware stuff before we start diving into the acquisition side of things? Cool. Well, let's talk about Lidar data acquisition. So here's the most common workflow that we see when it comes to actually acquiring data for drone Lidar processing. Step one, you go to your drone guy and you say, fly the drone on this site. Step two, you give the data to the drone guy. And step three is profit. This is about as much thinking goes into most drone programs in the actual flight data acquisition workflow. But we have found that better workflows will actually get you better, faster, more reliable results. Having a planned, clear workflow, set out the steps that you do will get you better data. That means step one is actually mission planning. Mission planning is, once you know how to do it, it is extremely easy, very, very short, takes very little time, and makes all the difference in the world. But you need to plan your mission before you go out to a site and actually start flying. Then is the actual data collection. Of all the steps on here, data collection is probably the easiest one out there because these drones fly on autopilot. If you do your mission planning right, you go out, open a drone, and push fly. That's it. The actual flying the drone part is super easy. You don't actually fly a drone anymore. Well, you can if you're having fun, if you're taking pictures for a wedding or something, sure. But for any sort of survey mission, you really shouldn't ever be touching the thumbsticks. You just push go and it flies itself. Even in an emergency situation, you push come home. You don't really fly a drone anymore. From there, you go through your point cloud processing. This is going to be that kind of proprietary step, typically where you turn it into an actual point cloud. You've got to then verify the accuracy of it. That is another really important, often overlooked, and often misordered step. This is typically where you want to be verifying your accuracy before you actually start doing all of your line work drafting, so that if you do have any sort of inaccuracies or errors or anything like that, you can go back and reprocess the point cloud and try and figure out what went wrong. And if you think, oh, well, I'm never going to get everything wrong because I have all of the workflows right, well then you haven't been surveying long enough to see all the creative ways that people can make mistakes and have accuracy go wrong, even through no fault of your own. But I've seen an awful lot of different ways that accuracy can go wrong, even when systems are used near perfectly. So accuracy verification to me is ridiculously important to make sure that your Lidar data matches with your photogrammetry data, which matches with your ground data. All three of those things should match within an acceptable level of tolerance. And I'll talk a lot about that, about accuracy, after the break. And then into line work drafting, which is actually going to be taking your ortho photos, your point clouds, all of your elevation data, and turning it into actual line work. That means a tin surface, not a 500 gigabyte point cloud, because no one really likes a 500 gigabyte point cloud. What people do like is a tin surface that might be a couple megabytes and has contours on it, and major and minor contours, and has everything correct, and has all the vegetation cleared out. That's the line work drafting, where you kind of see here, you're actually taking an incredibly complex surface, reducing it to curb lines, tin lines, spot elevation points, creating a tin surface, that sort of thing. And then your CAD integration is where you're going to put everything back together into CAD. CAD is where all of the data comes together at the end. Because LiDAR is going to be great for things like topo, but like I said, there's a lot of stuff that the LiDAR isn't going to do, boundary being the most obvious one, that LiDAR isn't going to be able to see a boundary line. All of that data is going to come together at the end in CAD. It's part of why it's important to do your accuracy verification first, so that you know when you do bring it all together in CAD, it all actually works nicely. You're going to maybe put your ortho photo from photogrammetry, your actually image on the background. Your LiDAR is going to be used for a lot of the topo data. You might use your photogrammetry as well for things like manholes and paint striping and parking spots for an Alta survey. And then you bring in your building corners that you shot on the ground and some of your boundary work or any other easement data that you might have, and put that all into CAD. That's where it goes together. This is what a good workflow looks like, not just kind of giving it to the guy and seeing what happens. Although oftentimes a lot of people have a very capable drone guy that can do all of that, but then when he goes on vacation, it's a problem. So in order to get this, the first thing about field data collection is this mission planning step. It is the most boring, easiest to forget, and also most important part. The other thing about mission planning that's just so critical is that if you are having problems processing your data, it might not seem like it, but there's a really good chance that your problem was from poor mission planning. Or not bad mission planning, probably no mission planning, or maybe just not ideal mission planning. Bad mission planning choices lead to a lot of struggles with actually processing the data. So that's the first step in all of this. It's what leads to all of the rest of these things, accuracy. So what is mission planning? When I say mission planning, well, it's just asking questions like, is this a good site for a drone at all? Should I even be flying the drone, or should I just send out a guy with a GPS unit? Is that going to be quicker? Should I be using photogrammetry or LiDAR, or both? In fact, some of the best workflows use both of them and only use LiDAR sparingly because LiDAR can be very time-consuming to process. What altitude should I fly at? 100, 200, 300, 400 feet above ground? What's the right overlap to fly my drone? And how many ground control points should I set to actually get the accuracy and reliability that I want in this project? That is what mission planning is for. So we're going to go through all those questions. So why care about mission planning? Well, number one, you can actually save a lot of field time. If you fly higher, then you don't spend as much time on the ground. If you set fewer ground control points, you don't have to spend as much time hiking around and setting targets. Shorter flight times matter a lot too. And most importantly is no field revisits. That's the biggest killer of time, is if you ever have to go back out into the field and collect more data. But you will also save office time, which means shorter processing times, hugely shorter processing times if you actually do it right. You can get better accuracy by having the right mix of flight altitude and overlap and control points, fewer photogrammetric and LiDAR errors as well, and what ultimately is a much simpler drafting workflow as well. And again, a reliable workflow matters. I showed the picture of the crash drone even again. That really doesn't happen unless you kind of take manual control of the drone and just start having fun with it. That's how we see most crashes. But getting reliable workflow means getting the right data the first time. It means no field revisits. It means no missed or missing data, and the right level of accuracy. So that's how we get it. Now the first question, like I said, is this the right site for a drone? Should you be using drones or LiDAR at all, or is there a better tool for the job? This is the weird part of my job, where I'm coming here to talk to you about LiDAR and telling you all the times you shouldn't be using LiDAR. But that's going to be the ones that'll save you the most money, or save you the most time and money by avoiding these. So what's a good project for a drone in general? Good projects in general are about 0.5 to 500 acres. Now is that a huge range? Absolutely, yes. But that's not everything. For example, if you're doing a single family house that's on a quarter of an acre or something, it probably doesn't make sense in terms of workflow to actually bring out the drone for it. It might, but usually not. You need to be at least half an acre or something before it kind of makes sense. And once you start getting above 500 acres, well, the world of aerial surveying, manned aerial surveying, very much still exists. They're very good at their jobs. And when you get to these larger sites, they start to become cost competitive. Does that mean you can't use a drone for 1,000 acres? No, of course you can, and we've done projects that are that big and even bigger. But that's at the point, 500 is at the point where you really ought to be looking and talking to traditional aerialists as well, just because you can save oftentimes a lot of time, because they can fly 500 acres really quickly, and a drone might take a while. With linear projects up to 20 miles, drones are really great for anything that needs topo, very good for Alta surveys as well, though you'll really want to make sure that you have good photogrammetry data. Any sort of planimetrics, volume calculations if you're doing quarries or stockpiles or anything like that. Bad projects are going to be very large projects where you might have more than 100,000 photos. Extremely high accuracy tolerances are another one. Like I said, if you ever have a project where the accuracy absolutely must be better than 1/10 of a foot, I'm thinking there are certain things where ADA disability ramps need to be that way, or even for railroad projects where they're actually measuring the rail ties and they have tolerances of just a couple hundredths of a foot or something, no drone is going to get you there. That's where you need to be on the ground with a total station or something like that. Indoor and underneath overhangs, drone is the wrong tool for the job. That's one of those, is it technically possible to use a drone and do mapping inside of this room? Technically, yes. Should you? No. So indoor, underneath overhangs, anything like that, drone is the wrong tool for the job. as well as when you need significant details underneath trees, like utilities. So drones, like I said, are great at penetrating through vegetation. They can see through trees. They're great at doing topo underneath those things, at least. If there is, for example, a roadway that is entirely covered with trees, tree canopy over the entire road, the drone's not going to be able to pick up or see the manhole that might be in the road and underneath those trees. That's something that a drone might miss, and you might need to have someone go and shoot that manually, because while it can look through and get the topo of the tree, it can't actually see the image underneath the tree, because it's kind of using that wavelength invisible to humans again. So you're likely to miss details that are underneath vegetation, things like that. And then is it a good project for LiDAR? Like I said, LiDAR works best in vegetated areas. This is one of the real key benefits to LiDAR, which means if your project site looks like this, that's a lot of trees. And you want to actually get mapping under those trees, LiDAR is great. Same thing here. You have a lot of dense green vegetation. For the record, with LiDAR, yes, you absolutely can still use LiDAR even in dense vegetation like this. Flying LiDAR in the winter, especially around here when all of the trees have fallen off, will get you even better data. I prefer doing it with all of the leaves off the trees. That does get higher quality data. But the real world doesn't always wait for the seasons. If you have flexibility in seasons, sure, flying it in winter can be more advantageous, but LiDAR does still work in these circumstances. That just goes back to another one of my things of how do you make it an actual business and not like a science fair project. If you're doing a science fair project, you wait until the absolute perfect conditions. When you're running a business and you actually need to get a job done, well, you don't have time for perfect, you have time for the real world, which means a lot of times you're flying LiDAR and it's going to be some really dense foliage and really dense vegetation, and you're going to have to deal with it in post-processing in terms of the data processing. And you absolutely can, it absolutely still works. So a site like this with that many trees is still great for LiDAR. Non-LiDAR might mean a project like that. If I were doing a high school that looked like that, I would probably say, nope, don't need LiDAR. Or if a client flew the site and sent me the data, sent me both photogrammetry and LiDAR data, our teams would look at that and we would pretty much throw out the LiDAR data and process everything with photogrammetry. Not because we can't, but because the workflow is so much easier. We'll save time, we'll save you time and money too, by processing all of that via photogrammetry only. There's just a couple of trees that you can just interpolate the topo underneath it pretty darn easily, or you can pull out just a couple of spot shots from the LiDAR if you want, but that's going to be one where photogrammetry makes a lot more sense. Same thing here for, again, your quarries and stockpiles or something where there isn't a blade of grass to be seen. If there are any new subdivisions where bulldozers have moved and it's just dirt, 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 then really there is absolutely no benefit to flying LiDAR there. Fly it, even if you have the LiDAR drone, fly photogrammetry only. That's my recommendation there. As far as LiDAR or photogrammetry, LiDAR, this is what a profile view looks like. Once we get more into the data processing side of things, I'm going to be showing a lot more profile views like this. So for those of you that aren't familiar, this is going to be a point cloud looking at it from the side. So a profile view, it's basically taking a single slice of a hillside and looking at it from the side. So what this is, if you can see, this on the bottom is going to be the actual ground, these dots that are in kind of green and blue. Those are the LiDAR dots. These are going to be the trees that are all bumpy and all the other vegetation that's up there as well, and that's going to be the photogrammetric point cloud, the photogrammetry derived one. Same project, same drone, processed together, this is what it looks like from the side. Now, the LiDAR, like I said, is uncolored, or in this case it's colored just by vegetation, or by elevation. And the photogrammetry is real-world colored because it's derived purely from imagery. And what you can see here is that the LiDAR is quite good at detecting the ground in places where the photogrammetry can't. Photogrammetry has some here, 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 here. LiDAR is pretty good, but it's not perfect. Here the shrubs and the vegetation was so dense that it actually didn't get anything. And actually there's a little bit of the flip side here. I remember from seeing the top-down view of this before. This is where it hits a stream and it starts having water. And LiDAR doesn't work in water, so the LiDAR actually stopped recording data here, but photogrammetry was able to pick up a couple of rocks. So using the blend of this, you can actually see where the ground level would be very, very, very clearly. It's a matter of how do you process that and draw that line times 10,000 different lines or something that you would have to do from profile. That's what we're going to talk about. But this is just the example of how much better LiDAR coverage is in vegetated areas at getting that background underneath bushes, underneath trees, things like that. Yeah?
Is it a fair point to say, though, that even those cases where you need true bare earth, that even that ground's not gonna be it? It might actually be vegetation, leaves, whatever the underlying brush is.
So this is where we go back to verifying accuracy and what level of accuracy do you need. If you go in the real woods, the ground floor is not going to be an absolute perfect, concrete level. It starts with thin leaves, and then it gets to thicker leaves, and then it kind of gets to mulch, and then it gets to the actual deeper soil. So how you survey it, what kind of tip you use on your rod, how far you push down, there are procedures to a lot of these things, but that matters. And same thing with grasses too, right? There are fields and grasses that might be 1, 2, 3 feet tall in terms of grasses. How do you define the accuracy there? So when it comes to accuracy verification, the answer is, well, test it. And I can tell you that in real world conditions, when you do things like this, that is, noise and mulch and leaves and stuff, you're probably looking at 2 to 3 tenths of a foot in terms of accuracy compared to being on the ground because of all of that real world noise. And that kind of goes back to, again, measuring final accuracy is going to be important because there are so many sources of real world noise. Whether it's just leaves that are on the ground, how you processed it. There's some really, really cool and clever techniques that I'll talk about later for things like grasses of how you can create some statistical averages to actually measure mathematically what is likely to be the grass points that were taken and what is likely to be the ground points, exclude the grass points, take a statistical average of the ground points, and create a topo surface from there. That's how we process it. And that's actually what a good LiDAR workflow is, because you can't, it's all the more reason why you can't just dump someone a full point cloud, because then the ground might be 2 feet thick. And the ground isn't 2 feet thick. So you have to kind of work with all of that together. You have to work with the noise to get the best result you can. And I can tell you that if you do the analysis after processing it right, even in circumstances with heavy vegetation, you're looking at about 2 to 3 tenths of a foot. So if you want 1 foot contours, plenty good enough. The other thing that you'll see, I have some pictures that'll show this visually, is you'll be able to, with that level of accuracy, you can see things like fallen logs underneath other trees very easily. You can see tire ruts from where a truck drove through in the topo map, because that's how sensitive and precise this is, even underneath dense vegetation. All right, why you should not use LiDAR then? This goes back to, again, I'm trying to help you, because using LiDAR when you shouldn't, that's where you're going to get the most frustrated about everything. Well, you should not use LiDAR because one is expensive. If you don't need a LiDAR drone, don't buy a LiDAR drone. Now, for some of you with smaller firms, you might only have 1 drone and you're going to buy a LiDAR photogrammetry blended drone. That's awesome, great, no problems there. But if you have 2 or 3 or 4 field crews or something like that, it would probably make sense to have 1 LiDAR drone and 2 or 3 photogrammetry ones, because you can get a very, very good RTK dual band GNSS enabled photogrammetry drone for under $10,000, whereas a LiDAR one is $35,000. Hardware is expensive, don't buy more than you need. In fact, that's another thing that I've often seen at companies that are bigger, is that they'll only have the 1 LiDAR drone because it's the best drone out there, and then all of their field crews race or wake up even extra early in the morning to go into the office so that they can take the drone, because they don't want to be schlepping through the woods and actually doing any of the surveying on ground, and whoever just is late to the office has to do it on the ground. Well, buy those guys a photogrammetry drone, it's so much cheaper. So having multiple different drones is totally okay. LiDAR drones are also very bulky and hard to fly. Our company is Flight Ops team. We have a couple of drones that we use to fly some sites kind of local to us, but generally speaking, if we don't need LiDAR, our Flight Ops guys don't want to fly it because it's a pain in the butt. The battery case weighs like 60 pounds for the LiDAR. The drone is huge. You need to bring, I think, 4 or 5 separate big bulky cases into your truck to actually fly LiDAR. versus photogrammetry is a briefcase. Our guys love flying photogrammetry when they can get away with it because, you know, they're spoiled. They have the option to pick which one they use. But I can tell you, it's so much easier to use. You'll wind up using a photogrammetry drone more if you have it. When you have both of them, you'll see the photogrammetry one gets way more use just because it's so much easier. Like I said, the accuracy is lower than photogrammetry typically. Processing LiDAR takes much more time, and in order to get the right data processing workflow, you're going to want to run your LiDAR processing in parallel with photogrammetry. It's additive, adds more time, adds more processing time. So this is another one of those, like, look, I love LiDAR, huge proponent of LiDAR, we process LiDAR every single day, but it is not the absolute be-all, end-all. It is not what everything should be. Unless you really like spending money, in which case, please give me a call, I'll take it. But no, if you can get away without using LiDAR, that is going to be a better solution. If you do need to use LiDAR, that's what we're going to keep talking about. So just to kind of summarize a lot of this LiDAR photogrammetry style stuff as part of mission planning, LiDAR works best in vegetated areas or power lines. That's a little bit of an edge case, but that's one where also LiDAR is unquestionably the tool to use. But LiDAR works best in vegetated areas. It provides very good ground data in vegetation. And there's what I said, the 2 to 3 feet typical accuracy in heavily vegetated areas. Photogrammetry works much better on hardscape. When it comes to curb lines, for example, or manholes, or paint striping, or anything like that, photogrammetry is much better. You want to combine all of your final data in CAD. That's the last step, where whatever software you use, and I'll cover those softwares after the break, whatever software you use, you combine all of it together in CAD at the end. That's the last step. And a good workflow is what makes all of the difference. Using and processing LiDAR is way more time consuming than photogrammetry alone, and bad workflows take that and multiply the amount of time that it needs to All right, so that's the LiDAR versus photogrammetry and kind of mission side of mission planning. Next up is your GNSS workflow options. So again, GNSS, GPS, I use them interchangeably. They are technically different, but whatever. So what GNSS correction style to use? We're going to get a little bit technical here, and then I'm going to bring it back into what's actually a little bit more simple. So there are, generally speaking, 3, or more accurately, there's a 4th that isn't listed up here, but 3 different ways to use GPS corrections on a drone. Now a drone is a little bit different from a lot of the ground-based GPS that you're used to. You're probably used to being able to take your rod, set it up, take a 1, 2, 5, 10 second, or maybe if you want to do an Opus solution, 20, 30, 60, 120 minute observation on a single point. A drone doesn't get to do that because a drone is in the air. It is moving, it is buzzing, it is flying, it is kicking around. It cannot do static solutions. It is constantly on the move. And in order to get the LiDAR corrected, it needs to use a combination of RTK data. Yes, you can post-process it as well. RTK being real-time kinematic for doing it live. PPK, post-processing kinematic, for doing it after the fact. But it needs high-precision GPS correction data in order to be accurate. And there are, generally speaking, 3 different ways that you can actually get this. Number 1 is to use a DJI base station or a base station that comes with the drone. That means you're going to set up a DJI base station, stick it in the ground, push on, set it up. It is the simplest to set up and use, but you do need to buy an additional piece of equipment. I'm assuming basically everyone in here has Trimble or Leica or TopCon equipment already or something like that, and probably don't want to buy another base station, which I totally get. With the benefits of using the DJI DRTK2 base station is it's the most simple and reliable workflow, and it is, in our opinion, it is the best for most jobs. Not every job, but for most jobs, this is going to be one of the easiest because, again, I go back on that workflow reliability.
Is that part of the 35,000?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the base station cost for the DJI DRTK2 base station is on the order of about $3 grand. So it's not expensive. It's not crazy expensive. It's not like a new Trimble unit. It has the trade-off of being it's kind of a one-trick pony. DJI says it's like, oh, you can use this for surveying. You absolutely cannot use it for surveying. You do not want to use it to replace your existing base or rover. It has one purpose, and that is for streaming RTK corrections as a local base station to a drone. That's all it does, and it does that quite well. It's kind of, you push one, it only has 3 buttons. You push one button, it turns on, it goes green, and it streams RTK corrections. At that job, it is fantastic, but that is its only job. That's all it does. The other options are going to be your existing base station. Like I said, Trimble, Leica, TopCon, etc. The vast majority of them are capable of streaming corrections directly to a drone, like the DJI drone, or some of your other ones might have their own custom things. The benefit is that it's equipment that you already own, less stuff that you have to bring in the field. The drawbacks are that it's a technically challenging setup and connection. You have to actually understand some of the internet protocols behind the N-trip protocol so that it's actually beaming it. You have to be able to set up the actual rate at which which is collecting observations, because like I said, the drone's moving at 30 feet per second, so it really wants a high frequency correction solution, so like a 5 hertz every 0.2 seconds solution, and then beaming that to the drone, typically over Wi-Fi, something like that. Is it manageable? Absolutely. If you like technology, if you're very comfortable with this sort of technological setup, as well as troubleshooting when either Wi-Fi is not working right or something like that, then this might be a good solution for you guys, if you are comfortable with that kind of tech setup. The DJI base station is very, very simple and very reliable. This one is less equipment, but much more technologically complex, a little bit longer field setup, 5 or 10 more minutes to actually push all the buttons, make sure everything's beaming, etc., etc. But both are fully capable of getting comparable results. The other thing that's really popular is a network correction service where you use no other equipment at all, no local base station, it's just streaming it. Now, we actually really don't like this for LiDAR data. It is capable of getting good data for photogrammetry only, but we really don't like it for LiDAR. And that's because network correction services with drones are different from network correction services for typical just ground-based surveying. Like I mentioned earlier with the ground-based survey, you can set it up and take a 5-second observation. If you're using network corrections, the software is capable of averaging all of that out, taking the 5-second correction, making a 5-second observation, collecting all of that and taking an average, and it can get a very, very good result. However, the drone is not capable of doing it. It is, like I said, moving at 30 feet per second, it's bucking and kicking, it's moving all around and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So the error introduced by these longer baseline distances, and baseline distance being effectively the distance from the drone to whatever base station you're using. Those matter a heck of a lot more with LiDAR than they do for photogrammetry, and an awful lot more for drones than they do with on the ground. So using a network correction service, when it comes to LiDAR, I would only use this in areas with really good base station and cell service coverage with LiDAR. With photogrammetry, again, you can get away with it a little bit more. I still don't love it because so often, like, job sites are in places with no cell service, and then you're just kind of in trouble. Or you're relying on a public core station for post-processing corrections, and it was down that day, and then you're just kind of out of luck, whatever. In my experience, I don't love network correction services for drones. And again, that's not to say if you're using a network correction service for actual, like, ground-based surveying and mapping, great, that's fantastic. Drones are a little bit of a different ballgame, and I don't like it, again, because of that reliability thing. Having a local base station is absolutely the superior result. I mentioned there was a fourth option. It is possible to use kind of none of these, focus exclusively on PPK and public base stations, or exclusively on ground control and IMU data. Those are kind of admittedly antiquated at this point. Yes, there are technically other ways that you can even do it, but I don't really like those. Our recommendations are kind of in order. DJI base station is our favorite, with an existing base station a close number 2, if you are comfortable with it. There is actually, I'll add one last thing. If you are ever doing very large projects, and this is where I'm talking in the 500 acres or so of LiDAR, where you're gonna have multiple takeoff locations, you're gonna be moving your base station around, you're gonna be carrying it with you. Those are some of the things where the more technological capabilities of a Trimble or a Leica base station are going to become more advantageous. So for very large projects, actually using an existing base station can be beneficial. But you can actually get away with the DJI base station even in those. It just takes a little bit more post-processing trickery, I would say. Yeah.
Are the connections between your base and your UAS, are those based on radio frequency or internet connectivity?
Radio frequency. So the way that it actually works in almost all circumstances is the you set up your local base if you have a local base station, and that streams to the controller, and then the controller is what speaks to the drone via radio frequency. So all of this works in areas with absolutely no GPS or no anything coverage whatsoever. Again, part of the reason I love local base, we work all over the country, and I'm sure there are definitely plenty of places around here that are far away from developed areas. And yeah, these are just more reliable because they don't need cell service, they don't need anything at all.
So from base station to controller is by radio, or that's by Wi-Fi?
That is often Wi-Fi, depending on what, so usually it's Wi-Fi, but it doesn't need an internet connection. It just needs, Wi-Fi is merely the like protocol that is used to broadcast it from an existing base there. The DJI base station actually uses its embedded radios, so it's still over a 2.4 gigahertz band, but I'm getting probably more technical than is necessary. So yes, it is typically Wi-Fi from the base station to the controller, but you don't need internet or cell service or anything like that.
Does the DJI base station use minimum satellites, or how many does it need to work?
So it uses all of the publicly available systems, so GPS, GLONASS, Baidu, and all of those things. I believe it requires a minimum of 7 before that it really wants, but like most things, it will tell you if it's getting a fix or float solution, which then takes into account all the things, number of satellites, the angle above the horizon, and your, tropospheric interference and whatnot. And it'll just tell you when you have a fixed solution. I very, 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 very rarely see that a local base cannot get a fixed solution as long as the base station's not set up near a building or under a tree or something. If you got a clear view of the sky, it's gonna get like 30 satellites that it can see now. It's crazy the numbers that are there. And I know the US is launching the newest Gen 3 GPS satellites too, which have some really cool capabilities, but that's a little bit more before that network becomes fully capable. I'm going to talk in post-processing a little bit more about these, like I said, after the break, about the different GNSS corrections to use, because how you then, even with all of these three, how you process it is going to make a little bit of a difference as well. Because, for example, you could take the base station data, and when you have multiple base stations, you run an Opus solution on each one, whether you set it up over a known point. There's some real nuances. You can go really, really deep. But if I can jump, like I said, I'm going to started by going deep, but to bring it back quite a bit, our recommendation is always use a local base. I don't care which local base you use, but a local base for LiDAR is really going to be critical to getting good accuracy. Use a local base station. Between these two, if you really love technological troubleshooting and you're good at it, then you can use your own base. If you aren't supremely confident that you can troubleshoot Wi-Fi issues and N-trip issues and IP, and you're not comfortable typing in an IP address to connect these things, then use the DJI base station. It will absolutely get you good enough data. Is it going to be as high quality as a Trimble? No, but it is good enough, and that's what really matters to me. It's still a good enough dual band GPS tripod that you can stick into the ground and stream corrections to. So that's kind of our recommendation for it. All good for now? All right, let's now talk about planning for your required accuracy. Number one, start with your desired results when you're actually planning out for a mission. Like I mentioned before, don't start with, I want the best accuracy possible. Because if you do, it's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars per project, because there are ways that you can get the best accuracy. You can always get better accuracy. So start with what you actually need. Because these are some of the questions that we often hear. I want the best accuracy possible, or just fly as low as you can so that we don't miss anything, or hey, why don't you fly it first and we'll see what data we get from it. Well, what this ends up getting you is either super expensive collection and processing costs when you just go for the best accuracy possible, and what could have been done in 2 hours in the field takes 2 weeks. Just fly as low as you can so we don't see anything means that the project will take weeks or months to complete, because what could have been maybe 10 gigabytes worth of LiDAR data now is 200 gigabytes of LiDAR data that has to be processed and filtered, et cetera, et cetera. Or fly it first and we'll see what data we can get from it, means that you have data that will be ultimately useless because you don't actually know what you're trying to extract, so you never get anything useful out of it. These are common things that we see, common statements that we get, and I can tell you the answer is, like I said, start with your desired results. What accuracy do you need? Does your project absolutely need 1/10 of a foot accuracy? Well, that means you're going to cover about 10 acres per flight, which would take 6,000 photos for a 100-acre flight if you're covering a hypothetical 100-acre thing, at a flight altitude of 150 feet. So let's go that kind of backwards now. Let's say that you had a 100-acre site and you wanted to fly it at 150 feet. Well, 100 acres with 10 acres per battery, that means you're doing 10 flight batteries, 10 flights. That's a lot. If you flew it at 400 feet, you could do it in 2 flight batteries, 750 total photos, and it'll get you 3/10, usually a little better, about 2/10 of a foot accuracy. Now, if this was 100 acres of woods, and your client wants 1 foot contours and to know where all of the streams are, I can tell you this would be a real bad idea to survey 100 acres where you need a 1/10 of a foot accuracy, for a point every 6 inches on the ground or something. That would take an enormous amount of time, and it would just be overkill. If you need 1 foot contours, then you should be flying at 400 feet. If you're doing a gas station as-built survey or something like that though, then yeah, flying at 150 feet makes a heck of a lot more sense. If you're doing a small subdivision or something, really, I can tell you kind of my Goldilocks rule. 250 feet really is kind of the Goldilocks level flight altitude for most things. If you're flying anything that's just 1 or 2 or 3 acres or something, then sure, fly at 150 feet. And if you're flying something that's north of 100 acres, then you'll probably want to fly at 400 feet. For pretty much everything else, 250 to 300 is your Goldilocks zone for most drone projects. But like I said, it kind of starts with what you're expected, like what your target accuracy needs to be, and what type of data that you have. Any questions on this as far as accuracy goes? Cool. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, 300-acre open farm ground, no crops. I'll throw the best accuracy possible. The photogrammetry sounds like that's kind of the route.
Yeah, photogrammetry is going to be the best route. Photogrammetry at probably, like I said, 300 feet above ground. You could use it with, if you had either a Phantom 4 RTK, which for the past 3 years has really been the gold standard of, or not gold, like really the workhorse of drone surveying for the last couple of years. And that's been very recently replaced with the Mavic 3 RTK. I would use one of those, Phantom 4 RTK, Mavic 3 at 250, 300 feet above ground. You'd be able to fly it easily in less than a day, probably half a day or something. And yeah, if there aren't any woods or tall crops or anything, and it's just dirt, that's going to be the way to go. And again, I say best accuracy possible. It does get tricky because yeah, there are ways you can do it on the ground, right? You could do it with a ground-based laser scanner and move it every 100 feet and scan it again. And that's going to get you 3/100 of a foot accuracy on every single dirt clod on that field. But I'm assuming you don't want 3/100 of a foot accuracy on every single dirt clod on that field. So that's why I always say start with those desired results. Because there really is such a thing as too much data. Too much data takes a huge amount of time to process, and the advice for this is don't fly lower than you need. This is a common pitfall, again, that we've seen this time and time again. It also, in addition to gathering too much data, there hits a point of negative returns too. There's what I often call the drinking straw effect, where it's like you're trying to survey something by looking through a drinking straw because you're so close to the ground, the image of the ground is just this tiny little footprint. And you're taking so many photos trying to stitch them together, actually winds up getting you worse results, lower accuracy, worse accuracy than if you flew higher. That trade-off is anything below 100 feet, you are actually getting diminishing returns. Very quickly diminishing returns too. 90 feet above ground will get you worse accuracy than 110 feet above ground. Kind of sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but again, it's that drinking straw effect, in addition to making it take forever to process. And also, like I said, just don't use LiDAR if you don't need it. It's a lot of data and a lot of time to process. All right, we've got a couple of minutes. Any other questions? Sorry, I wasn't looking now. I'm going to go through a little bit of this before we then take off onto our break. So, talking about flight pattern and overlap. So, first of all, overlap. Overlap is the amount, as a drone flies, it's going to fly back and forth, typically in what's called either a lawnmower flight pattern, if you're a normal human, or a booster-photonic flight pattern, if you're a weirdo like me. And when it's taking photos going forward and side to side, some of those photos overlap. The amount of overlap is a subject of a great deal of debate and discussion amongst surveyors and photogrammetrists and LiDAR technicians, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately that is because there really are very different requirements between traditional photogrammetry, which works with very high-end, very precisely calibrated cameras, and modern digital photogrammetry, which works with generally uncalibrated cameras that are, even in the factory, have slight differences amongst them and are much more sensitive to things like temperature, vibration, and humidity. And so what that means is when a traditional photogrammetrist says, well, I usually fly with 35% overlap or something like that. Well, yes, they can get away with much lower overlap because they are using extraordinarily high-end cameras. Whereas digital photogrammetry kind of makes up for that deficiency with much, much higher overlap. It's become pretty much industry standard that for drone-based photogrammetry, the target overlap is around 75-75. So 75% front overlap, 75% side overlap. Some people say, oh, I prefer 70-80 or 80-70 or blah, 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 something like that. Yeah, there's definitely some flexibility in there, so I'm not going to be here and say it's exactly 75, whatever. But 75-75 is typically the good photogrammetry overlap. Now, LiDAR is the one that is really interesting because it's very similar to photogrammetry in that if you have a $1 million LiDAR sensor, then you can get away with very low overlap, which is what traditional manned aerial LiDAR would be. They don't want to do more overlap because that's more flight time, and the amount of fuel that you're burning on these planes, the cost of operating manned aircraft is so high, it makes sense to spend a lot more money on the sensor so that you can have less time in the air. But with drones, the LiDAR sensors, they're not quite as good as the manned ones. And that's even, like I said, those, the non-DJI ones, those are not as good as manned LiDAR as well. Because LiDAR is big, it's heavy, it takes a lot of power. If you can put it on an airplane and have a 50-pound LiDAR system, yeah, that's going to be a better LiDAR unit. But no drone can carry that weight or push out that much power. So we have found that actually having LiDAR overlap, laser-based overlap, of around 60% is very beneficial to the reliability of the workflow. Yes, that one does take a little bit more time in the field. One of the few times here where I'm going to give you a recommendation that might make you take more time in the field. But that's because it increases that level of reliability. Because a lot of times, especially with these, not $1 million LiDAR systems, you have things that, like, at very high scan angles, the drone might, the LiDAR system might actually lose some of its accuracy, and you start seeing a half of a foot worth of spread or error when you were expecting 2 or 3/10. When you have this level of overlap, you can say, all right, cut out anything with a scan angle above 30 or above 25%, and that actually will then let you cut out the bad data and keep good, reliable data without having to have a field revisit. Likewise, like I said, vegetation penetration isn't perfect. You increase the overlap, it actually gives the camera the LiDAR sensor many more angles with which it can find gaps in that vegetation area and get better ground coverage and that sort of thing. So we've seen a lot of default LiDAR systems that set up with this really, really low overlap. And the problem is when it works, but when it doesn't, you have to throw it out. And that kind of sucks. Or if you have a strip down the middle where there's no data, it's just a 10-foot wide strip where you had the overlap, but it didn't quite work because there was a hill that made your effective overlap lower, and you have a strip of no data, and you have to go back in the field and fly it again. That's what really sucks. So when it comes to LiDAR overlap, we've seen the industry kind of generally does not enough overlap in terms of LiDAR overlap right now. All right, it is now past 2 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and stop for our break. So we will be rejoining here at 2:30. Thank you for putting up with me talking so far, and I look forward to talking more about this in a couple minutes. Thank you for coming back. We're going to get started right here because even though I know it is a Friday afternoon and everyone is really excited to get on with the weekend, I actually have way more content than I'll be able to fit in for an hour, but I'm sure no one wants me to actually sit and hold everyone another hour late. I did get a couple of questions during the break of will the slides be available? The answer is absolutely yes. In fact, here is what is the end slide, which is we are video recording this presentation as well. So if you would like a copy of the slides or a copy of the video to either watch it again or to share it with anyone else in your office, go ahead and either enter your email at that link, aerotoss.com/ISPLS23, or you can email me for that, or for anything or any other questions you may have at logan@aerotoss.com. Likewise, small shameless plug, we do data processing, we would love to show you what we can do. If you want a free project, go ahead and email me, and we would love to get that set up. So, with that, I will dive back in and we can get back going on overlap and everything from here. I'm going to be moving pretty quickly because checking after the break, I actually have a ton of data processing stuff to cover. So I still absolutely want your questions, but I'm going to be moving a little quicker than I did before. And maybe that energy will help keep everyone awake for that last bit of Friday before it's officially the weekend. All right. Still on flight planning though, talking about nadir versus oblique imagery. Nadir being absolute straight down and oblique imagery being off at an angle. Another one of those things that's big on mission planning because a lot of people think that, or a lot of softwares I should say, really try and push oblique image capture for varying different things. I'll skip to the conclusion pretty quickly on this, which is that obliques can often offer better identification of vertical features, thinking like the facades of buildings. They almost always have zero impact in terms of survey accuracy or quality. It is at the cost of a lot more processing time when you do have an oblique angle, and actually resulting accuracy is not improved, it's often worse. Because I've always really liked this chart. A nadir camera pointing straight down, if this is what the kind of image looks like at the ground, when you go at an oblique, what you will see towards the horizon is that the actual size of features gets way, way, way smaller. Your effective resolution, or as a surveyor would say, ground sampling distance, becomes way lower as the actual ground becomes further away from the drone. So oblique doesn't actually add anything. However, there are some circumstances now for anyone that has an M300 with the P1 camera, or any drone that maybe has a 35mm camera lens, which is a little bit more narrow field of view than we typically like. Those longer focal length cameras can actually benefit from an advanced oblique capture system that allows it to take multiple images at different angles and get you more coverage, but that's a little bit of a different ballgame. In general, for photogrammetric mapping, nadir is the way to go in terms of saving overall processing time and getting good enough quality, because adding those oblique photos does not actually really improve quality very much at all. Lighting conditions with LiDAR and honestly photogrammetry is another interesting question that we get with surveying and mapping, because people say, what's the best lighting condition to fly in? And my first answer would be, well, don't wait for the best, because once again, this is in the real world. You're not going for a scientific, perfect map. What you would actually want is, in the perfect world, is to fly it twice. Once you wait for an absolute perfect overcast day where there are no shadows whatsoever and everything is very nicely illuminated right around high noon and completely overcast. That is best for photogrammetry. For LiDAR, you want to fly absolutely in the dead of night with no light whatsoever, so that any of the noise that is caused by the sun and reflections off of water or the ground or erroneous feedback is completely reduced. The noise floor goes to zero. Both of those things are completely impractical, to either wait for a perfect day for photogrammetry or fly at night. There are some circumstances where you might want to fly at night for like power lines, but again, it's pretty edge case scenario there. The point is, fly when you can. Anytime when there's daylight, it's typically going to be good enough, and that's part of on the post-processing side of things, is to actually manage the noise that is caused by this. So yeah, don't wait for perfect. Yes, it makes a difference. If you were doing something where the actual image quality, the aesthetic quality of it mattered, then you would want to wait for an overcast day with no shadows. But harsh shadows do not meaningfully impact the quality of the data. Some people say, oh, but I looked at this shadow and there's like a spike in the photogrammetry point cloud. Yes, that can happen, and you should clean it up in post-processing. It's not worth waiting for a perfect day to fly something like that.
Hey, Luke.
Yeah.
Nice.
Of course.
Deal obliques.
Mhm.
I know it's a little bit different animal for photogrammetry, but specific to obliques, the way DJI Pilot 2 does it with LiDAR and the L1, is there really any advantage to flying the oblique missions with the L1?
No.
I didn't.
Yeah, is the short answer. None there. The only one where we do recommend using their smart oblique capture is with the P1 camera, and that is driven because of that 35mm lens, that they don't have a 24mm lens. All right, so let's talk about types of flight patterns as well. This is the most common and the one that we recommend in 99% of circumstances, which is a single grid boost. Well, not 99, that's too many, too high, but for most projects, a single grid is going to be the flight pattern that gets you the right amount of data. And here are some samples for where you might set your ground control points on just stupid, plain, simple site. You don't even need 5 control points on that one. Double grid is something that a lot of flight softwares really try and push. They say fly once north to south and once east to west, or something like that. We have done a number of very high quality accuracy studies with 50 to 100 check shots on the ground, and can tell you pretty unambiguously that this does not improve the quality of your data. It does, however, dramatically increase the amount of time that it takes to process, the amount of time it takes to move the data around, and the amount of time it takes to fly it. The actual difference in accuracy was not statistically significant. It rounds to 0. It does not make a difference. So we strongly, strongly, strongly discourage any sort of double grid. It is just not necessary. Yeah.
So what about in a heavily, this was open, but in a heavily wooded area? We do it sometimes that way because we're thinking we're gonna get penetration in areas that you couldn't.
Yeah, so it,
Shadow. And that creates noise.
yeah, so there's always noise. This is another one of those things, like, dude, it goes back to that idea of good enough versus perfect, right? Are there technically some advantages in edge cases to doing a double grid? Sometimes, maybe a little bit, is probably the most miserable answer I can give you. Sometimes there might be a little bit of an advantage to it, but in almost all circumstances, we have found that this is not going to be beneficial. Typically then, like if you're doing densely vegetated, if it's so dense that photogrammetry can't process, then, well, you could either double grid or you could even up your overlap to like 80% instead of 75. And that actually can have a comparable one to a comparable result to a double grid. When you are mentioning shadows, yes, there are some lighting angle projects where if the sun is at exactly the wrong angle, that it has different things. Same thing with power line corridors sometimes, but those really seem to be the exception. And the amount of processing, extra processing and field and data time that it takes, we just don't recommend it. If you fly this and you want to fly it, I'm not going to tell him, you're not breaking the law. But we have found it to be no meaningful improvement in the data quality that comes out of it. Yeah.
So are you talking, it seems to me you're talking double gridding from an ortho generation perspective or photogrammetry perspective.
Same thing with LiDAR generally too.
We found, just like this gentleman over here says, that a double grid in high density canopy can give you secondary look. You got a secondary chance to look through the trees and get down to the ground and have more densified, detail like a creek line or things like that. But so we might fly a double mission for LiDAR, which in my opinion, the LiDAR is much easier to process than the photogrammetry. And then just use one of the missions for photogrammetry to cut down on the number of images.
So that is a really great point, and I'll tell you some of this depends on some more nuanced factors. First of all, multiple missions, photogrammetry and LiDAR, I would always recommend flying them simultaneously.
Well, I
Secondly,
mean, that they're flown simultaneously, but it's two separate flight missions, so I can choose to use only images off of one flight mission.
got it, that makes sense. The other thing I would say that actually matters is the, well, first of all, what overlap you're using. If you're already using a low LiDAR overlap, then flying, having those multiple chances, like you said, that is important. It's part of why I was saying earlier, I recommend higher than usual overlap on LiDAR. So it's kind of higher overlap, but in a single grid pattern versus lower overlap in a double grid are often going to have comparable results in that sense. And then lastly is the type of LiDAR sensor you do and the return pattern matters. Some LiDAR sensors look straight down and basically only go left, right. Other ones do more complex patterns where they go left, right, and forward and back, which means that in a single grid pattern, if it's doing one of those nonlinear LiDAR sensing patterns, it actually is getting angles with the right overlap, front, back, left, and right. It's getting every single side that the LiDAR sensor can see in a single grid pattern. So that depends on your LiDAR sensor. So these tests, I will admit, all of our testing was done with the DJI L1 sensor. So if you are not using the DJI L1 sensor and have a different one, it is very possible that that the LiDAR scan angles are going to be different.
What's the beam pattern on the L1?
It's like a flower pattern. It's an irregular flower pattern.
Do you ever get a true nadir look at the ground, or is it always at an off angle?
No, it points straight down often, yeah.
I mean, the laser pattern.
Yes, the laser pattern
will-
does.
At times will be true nadir.
Correct. And all that data is definitely stored in there as well, so you actually know what your scan angle is directly, where the beam angle was. So you can see the flight pattern just by looking at like the beam angle and that sort of thing. Another common flight pattern that we do actually recommend are like linear missions where you are flying along a individual swath. This is great for corridors, pipelines, things like that. Very, very useful. General rule of thumb with these is we usually recommend at least 3 flight lines for any linear mission. Again, you can often get away with a little bit less with like 2 flight lines, especially with LiDAR or something like that. We prefer 3 on the data side. Again, it's about data redundancy in this case and having that overlap. And like we were just talking about with vegetation, having multiple angles to try and get the ground. So this one has 5 different flights, paths on a linear mission, but 3 is good enough. And the last thing that is very important, or occasionally important, is going to be terrain awareness. Terrain awareness is where the drone, you basically import a map of the ground and the drone tries to follow the ground. So as it goes up a hill, the drone goes up a hill too, so that it tries to stay an even, call it 200 feet above ground level. Rule of thumb, this is something that you'll want to use if there's more than 100 feet of elevation change on your project site. That's just, again, general rule of thumb. Anything less than that, you can get away with a single flight pattern even as the ground moves underneath it. That's no big deal. But if you're flying a single flight with more than 100 feet, you'll want to do something like this. It's a little more complicated in the actual mission planning side of things because you do have to import the terrain into your flight controller, make sure your overlap's there. The software's been getting a little bit better at all of this, but terrain awareness is something that is very useful for significant elevation change on projects. We just got some examples that we see in mission planning of making sure you have proper overlap and everything, that you don't have gaps where there's only a single flight line of photos or something. That's always important. So just to go over a summary of what we recommend our best practices are. And again, these are just our best practices for most sites. It's not meant to be prescriptive of all sites all the time. Single lawnmower flight path, 75-75 overlap for photogrammetry, and nadir only with no obliques is the general rule that we like to see for most projects. All right, moving forward to setting ground control points and check shots. Ground control points and check shots are where a lot of the actual accuracy from your project is going to come. So as far as setting GCPs, with everything we're talking about here, we're kind of assuming now that whatever drone you use has either RTK or PTK capabilities on it, which was not the case a couple of years ago. So just, that's a caveat worth noting. Everything I'm talking about assumes that it's RTK. If you're using an old Phantom 4 that does not have RTK, for example, you will need to be setting more ground control points than I recommend in this. But our recommendation is a minimum of 3 GCPs, with high contrast colors, so you can actually see them often on the LiDAR as well, and with more if you have larger flights or moving base stations. The reason I say with high contrast colors is because what the LiDAR looks like before you add colorization to the LiDAR is it looks like that. Hilariously, I can promise you these actually are the exact same site. I don't know why I took the time to make sure that the screenshot meant something, because clearly it doesn't look the same. Anyway, you want to make sure that it's high contrast colors, because this is what the point cloud looks like. There are actually other ways to look at it as well with LiDAR. For example, the intensity return is something that can be used where those high contrast colors actually make a difference so that you can still pick out the center of a GCP using LiDAR. Now, LiDAR does have slightly lower XY accuracy than Z accuracy. Its horizontal is not quite as good as it is vertical, but that's okay because when you're geolocating the point cloud, because that XY doesn't quite matter so much on LiDAR, it's mostly going to be for the topo and vertical side of things. As far as marking ground control, how you want to actually mark ground control, this matters more than a lot of people give it credit to, especially when the person that is flying the drone and marking the control is different from the person processing it. This is a big workflow thing. For example, when you have non-high contrast colors, like whether you use bucket lids or just like a plain white square or something, that's not great for finding the exact center. You can guess, but it can add, a tenth of error or so. I don't like corners or corner of concrete or something like that, or even edge of paint stripe, because if there's a parking spot lot, there are lots of edge of paint stripes, knowing exactly which edge, which corner, whether it's the center. There's often ambiguity behind it, so corner of concrete isn't ideal. I actually don't like chevrons too. This is kind of a personal thing, partly because I work with surveyors all over the country, and I see some surveyors mark the front tip, some mark the inside corner, some mark the middle point between the inside and outside corner, but the only consistent thing is every surveyor thinks that the way they do it is how everyone else ought to be doing it too. And then we saw that one time, which honestly, if that's your ground control point, more power to you. But those aren't going to be ideal. We use bright colors. Black and white is, I find, an interesting one that when photogrammetry used to be all black and white was the color of ground control points. And now that everything's in color, I like pink and green because, boy, you can find that ground control point from very, very far away, and it works great with LiDAR too. When you are doing corridor missions, whether it's a roadway, a pipeline, or a power line corridor, general rule of thumb is a zigzag pattern we have found to be the most effective. If you want to set pairs along a roadway as well, that works too, but you're just setting twice as many as you kind of really need to. Rule of thumb here, again, just good rule of thumb accuracy. It can be different depending on how much data you do, but a maximum of about 1,000 feet between ground control points linearly, and that's assuming that you've got all of your GPS stuff set up properly as well. Zigzag pattern with pairs of GCPs recommended at the endpoints, the start and the beginning of the project, just to make sure you don't actually accidentally have any sort of tilt introduced into your project towards the end. So how many GCP ground control points do you need with RTK? Our opinion, my opinion, is that no control is not good enough for land surveying. Hey, I got a fan. All right. No ground control is not good enough. Is it technically possible to use the GPS from the drone in your base station and post-process it into a way that gets you good data? Yes, it is technologically possible, but it adds an awful lot of risk of undetected errors. Errors from either just fat fingering something, using the wrong datum, not being aware that your camera was not perfectly calibrated, not localizing a project to the site properly. The amount of things that can go wrong when not using ground control is ridiculous, and if you have no ground control, you have no way to catch it. So is it technologically possible to do a survey without any ground control? Yes, and you shouldn't do it. You absolutely should have ground control points, or if you want to get very technical, at least checkpoints, if not ground control points. That is doable as well. But you need ground data to responsibly, as a surveyor, verify that your data is actually accurate. And that makes sure a lot of things. One, that your camera is properly calibrated. As I mentioned, drones are not laboratory calibrated cameras. They are done using software calibration after the fact. And tiny changes in that can move an entire surface up or down by easily a couple tenths of a foot. It's used to localize your project. Very often, whether you're using absolute true NAT83 or you're just setting up over a known point, you want to localize it to make sure that your existing data matches your old data, matches your ground data, matches your boundary data. Having the ability to detect errors is huge because errors can come from a number of reasons, many of which are avoidable, some of which are not, whether it's a solar flare that interrupted your ability to get an RTK fix that you weren't aware of, or a particularly big bug that hit the drone and the propeller introduced a new vibration into it that caused accuracy or something. Like the amount of sources of error that come in the real world are crazy. And the goal is not to avoid all of the error, it's to make it error tolerant so that you can, if there is some sort of error, you catch it earlier so that you don't actually ever give out bad data to a client. So our recommended is a minimum of 3 per project, plus about 1 per additional flight battery where practical. That is good enough, so if you're flying a drone flight and it took 3 flight batteries, then that would be about 5 ground control points as a minimum. You want to set extra for checks? That's a great idea. And this does require proper RTK, PPK processing workflows. If you don't have any of your GPS processed, or you have 2 flights and they seem to be offset by like 10 feet from one another, then just having a couple of control points, well, first of all, that should show you that error right away, but you do have to make sure that everything else works as well. So to kind of summarize mission planning, and then we'll get into all of the data processing, you need to know what data you need, plan your flight in advance, don't collect too much data, use a local base station, and set ground control points. If you just kind of follow these 5 things when planning for a mission, honestly, you're going to be good. A lot of the other stuff that we were talking about, single grid, double grid, exact flight overlap, is really secondary to some of these big things too. These are what are going to set you up for success in data processing down the line. All right. So now, I know we're running out of time and we're into the most exciting part of a Friday afternoon, which is data processing. Everyone loves software. All right, workflow overview again. Sorry, here we go. This is kind of the last, what I call 4 steps. So there are 4 main steps to processing LiDAR data. First is going to be point cloud processing. That's where you take the GPS, IMU, LiDAR data, all of that, go through what is typically a proprietary software to create a point cloud. Once you have that point cloud, you should verify the accuracy and actually make sure at that early on step that it is accurate before you start drafting. Then you go into line work drafting where you actually vectorize all of your features, you get your curve lines, you get your tin surface, and then you integrate it into CAD where you mix everything else. These steps, most people that have done this a lot have settled on this order as the best workflow to actually get these projects through consistently, which, as you know, is something that I care a lot about, which is consistency. Already gone through the most common workflow there. This is a little bit more detail of what these workflows often look like. So you actually start with photos, ground control, RTK, PPK stuff. It goes through the photogrammetry step, or in this case, LiDAR step as well, which will get you your orthophoto, a digital surface model, which DSM surface model includes all of the trees and stuff, as well as a raw point cloud. Go through what we often call line work drafting, where you extract a lot of those 3D points, your topo points, your features, polylines, typically in like a DXF format. Throw it into CAD, where you actually then get it into Civil 3D, add in all your site culture, your contours, create the actual tin surface, etc. And that's what gets you into your final deliverable. The LiDAR side of things is a little different. You start, like I said, I know I'm going through this a couple of times in different ways, but start with the raw data, align it, georeference it, make sure it's all properly georeferenced to your existing site. verify your accuracy, and then you go into classifying the point cloud as well, extracting the useful features from there. That's what I'm going to be talking about a lot. And having this better workflow will get you better results, and more importantly, it'll get it done faster. Because this is where the biggest amount of time is lost, is by spending a huge amount of time in this. I'm just going to go real quick through photogrammetry because I don't have all that much time. Photogrammetry is obviously creating 3D data from 2D photos, commonly done through software like Pix4D. Anyone that does this knows that it takes a lot of computing time. Photogrammetric processing can take big computers, that sort of stuff, and people will spend many, many thousands of dollars on there. As far as how you get photogrammetric processing done, you can either do it automated in the cloud, you can do it by buying a software like Pix4D or Agisoft Metashape or something, or you can outsource it to outsource photogrammetrists like us as well. So there are different ways to get photogrammetry done. Our general principles with how to process photogrammetry is to use an iterative process, use a cycle where you actually process every project multiple times, typically starting at very low levels of accuracy, and you really downsample your images a lot so that it processes very quickly, with the goal of surfacing any sort of errors and correcting for them as quickly as humanly possible to make sure that your GPS is set up right, that the guy that was shooting control in the field didn't set his rod to -6 feet instead of +6 feet as far as the rod height, or any of the other myriad errors that happen every single day. Catch those early, fix them without spending, you know, dozens of hours of computer processing time. So use an iterative loop, and we're huge believers of human in the loop. For all of the cool stuff that AI is doing these days, and there really is a lot of cool stuff out there, it is not replacing a human. That'll be one of the themes that you'll see over as I'm talking about a lot of data processing. Everyone wants there to be, hey, here's a big point cloud, push button, machine learning, artificial intelligence, black box, and you get a surface. Nope, we're not there yet. There are things that the automated software is doing that helps a lot, and you should use it. But it does. This stuff is not without a human in the loop still. People ask exactly what hardware we use. This is our kind of current stack of these computers. For anyone that knows this sort of, that really cares about the computer you'll buy, what you will see is that this is a very good, but by no means absolute bleeding edge, ultra high-end computer. These ones run about $4,000 or so to buy a computer like this, when you could easily spend $20,000 or $30,000. We have found that for most of this processing, a good workflow where you can actually run both photogrammetry, and this holds for Lidar as well, having multiple upper-end computers like this is far more efficient than having one or two $30,000 machines. So we have dozens of boxes like this, and for very large projects, we don't say, hey, here's a $30,000 computer with, you know, a crazy dual Xenon processor or whatever. No, we buy $4,000 like gaming computers basically, and then shard the projects up into individual different tiles and blocks and spread it out. We use that principle as far as processing for photogrammetry processing, for Lidar processing, etc. Break it up into more digestible chunks, shard it out, make sure that you have a good workflow for bringing it back together and checking your overlaps on the edges, and that seems to be a much more effective process than trying to have a $20,000 computer that then processes for 48 hours and really, really hoping that it processed correctly and you don't have to do it again. As far as using photogrammetry software correctly, it is not about the settings. There's no magical settings or magical computer that makes photogrammetry work. It is about the workflow. And that is because every project site is different. Some projects are flown with different drones, different weather conditions, different lighting conditions, whether there's snow on the ground or whether there's a huge amount of inaccessible valley that you couldn't set control points on, or, you know, what happened to your GPS, or did it lose GPS fix for RTK fix for part of it. Using photogrammetry is not about the settings, it's about having a repeatable workflow you can use.
Hey, Logan.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No.
With Pix4D, are you guys using Windows 11 for things? That's a random question.
I think the majority of our servers are on Windows 11, but it doesn't really matter. Or we haven't found anything big. I'm not gonna plant my flag on that one.
We're having issues with Pix. We're not sure if it's a Windows 11 issue or not.
We definitely use both. We have not had issues, at least with in terms of operating system. You do want to manage your processing time. Like I said before, that means this is often managed much more with mission planning. By the time you get here, your processing time is sometimes stuck based on how many photos were taken in the field. But a good workflow is worth much, much more than a good computer. I apologize for the people that do love computers. I'm one of them too. But honestly, if you want to if you want to upgrade from a $4,000 computer to a $10,000 computer, it's not going to fix the problems that you're probably having. Just being brutally honest with that. It's those they're diminishing marginal returns. The more money you spend on computers, you might get a 10 or 20% improvement in how long it takes you to process something, versus if you actually get a good workflow, then you can cut the amount of processing time by half. So good workflow is much more important than a good computer. All right, let's get into some LiDAR stuff too. Point cloud creation and manipulation to start with. So LiDAR point cloud creation is, like I was saying, going from the raw LiDAR data, which by itself only measures the distance from the laser to the ground. It needs to be combined with all of that other stuff. So that means the GNSS, the IMU, the gimbal data, and all of your imagery before you can get a useful colorized point cloud. This step, like I mentioned, is usually controlled by the LiDAR manufacturer, or rather the system integrator that put all of their software together there. So it goes from raw proprietary data, which is what it typically starts in, either proprietary and some sort of encoded but not particularly useful size. I'm going to discuss primarily the L1 because, like I said, that's definitely the market leader. It's the most common LiDAR drone out there. Where you use, with the L1, it's all in DJI Terra, is the software that they use, where you put in all of the proprietary raw imported stuff, oftentimes encoded, and it spits out a point cloud. And there are a couple of settings you can use about point density and GPS stuff, but thankfully this step of the process is fairly straightforward. As long as you follow the kind of manufacturer's suggested recommendations here, you are going to get good data. Granted, the tricky part, especially with the more complex ones, is if there are slight differences in how you format the Rhinex data of your base station, it might spit out some really wonky, either slightly wrong, which is actually the worst case scenario, because if it's really, really wrong, you notice it very easily. So really wrong is kind of not that bad, but slightly wrong is a big problem. But yeah, it's very proprietary. Spit it in and you should get out a point cloud, an LAS file. Ideally, hopefully it will be a colorized point cloud by this point as well. Again, that is primarily done by the manufacturer. You can colorize a point cloud after the fact by combining it with photogrammetry data, but it's easier if this is done at the this kind of pre-processing step. Here's also where you'll want to check to make sure that your LiDAR swabs are aligned. This is becoming less and less of a problem as GPS data processing gets better and better. Because if your GPS data is good, the drone should know where it's at, swath to swath, and the actual inaccuracies, the error between one swath and the next, should be within tolerances, within like a tenth of a foot or something like that. But it does happen nonetheless, especially if you do pick up your base station, move it to a different location. It's not set up over a known point, so you have to in post-process correct those two base stations to bring the swaths and bring the individual flights in alignment with one another. So this is kind of where you want to do that step. Again, before you're doing any classification of what is ground, what is building, or any data extraction, you want to do this on the early side where you visually take a look, check it, run some cross sections and profiles to make sure that your data does not look like this. If it looks like this, stop, take a step back, fix it before you go anything further, because if you try and get data out of this, then it's really not going to be very useful. This is also where you'll georeference it. And again, georeferencing ground control points, hugely important. We do a ton of work in California too, where georeferencing is extra important for us because the whole state's seismically active and it moves. So that means even if you did use pure NAT 83, it might be a foot off from the survey that was done a year ago. So localizing, setting up control points, and actually having those translations. But also, it's important to have a flexible workflow because not all projects are in pure, true NAT 83. A lot of them are set up on a 5,000 grid, and you need to be able to have a workflow that can accommodate that. Or I guess you don't need to, but we strongly recommend it because it's hard to tell a client what coordinate system they should use. You kind of have to provide it and match it with old data. So georeferencing it, using your ground control points to georeference it is going to be pretty important. Like I said, we really like ground control points, partly because they are so darn simple, reliable, cheap, and verifiable. There's a lot less black boxiness when you can just say, oh, well, you know, the accuracy of this laser should have been this, and it should do this because of the GPS, and it should provide this accuracy. But if you set a couple control points, you can say, boom, this is what it's looking like. So far, I've been using the word control points kind of interchangeably with check shots. I'll get into that in just a second. As far as georeferencing the point clouds go, Lidar Hardware, most of these companies out there rely primarily on GNSS and IMU processing alone without actually setting the control points. At least that first step where you kind of create it in the proprietary software, there's rarely the ability to put in control points or correct it or localize it or anything like that. But there are a lot of ways to georeference it. Honestly, you can use blended workflows, you can use photogrammetry to correct it. But either way, georeferencing it is a really critical step here. So where we're at so far in the LiDAR processing workflow, if we kind of go through these steps, this is all what it takes really just to create a point cloud. We haven't yet verified our accuracy, we haven't even classified our points, we haven't extracted any features yet, which is probably where a lot of people spend a lot of time. And well, not probably, it absolutely is where a lot of people spend a lot of time. But to kind of go back, the reason I put so much more emphasis on this stuff at the beginning is because if you get these two right, then these last two become a heck of a lot easier. Oftentimes, the reason it spends so much time is you spend a lot of time classifying points and extracting features, and then you have to do it again if you find the accuracy is wrong, or it was georeferenced, or you try and manipulate it after you've done it in different places. Getting the first parts down first will definitely save you the most amount of time. Okay, now we're getting into measuring and certifying accuracy, which is one of the trickier things to talk about, because we're going a little bit deep into the world of statistics, which I love, but not everyone does. So, statistics, what I'm going to be talking a lot about is the ISPLS, the American Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing. This is a nonprofit organization that has been around since 1934, that they are the gold standard when it comes to a lot of the real scientific and academic certification behind the science of photogrammetry. So we support them. We're not formally affiliated with them in any way. I am certified as well, but that's a good organization, and we're going to be talking a lot about accuracy according to their standards, which I think I talk about, there it is, their ISPLS positional accuracy standards. This is absolutely the document that you want to use if you ever have to formally certify or measure accuracy. Now it's deep, it's like 35 pages of like academic, scientific formulas of how to measure and set accuracy, so that when I say 1/10 of a foot accuracy, which I've said a lot through this, what I actually mean is a accuracy class of 1/10 of a foot according to the ISPLS positional accuracy standards. That is what I mean when I say accuracy. There are different accuracy standards. This is what I mean when I am saying that. And they're a robust series of things that actually have different standards, either what's called a produced to meet standard or a tested to meet standard, one of which is basically, we have shown that this is a reliable workflow, and so it should have an accuracy of 1/10 of a foot, versus we have actually used check shot data and we can verify that this is accurate to 1/10 of a foot, which is the higher bar, and that requires setting independent check shots to get to that higher tested to meet standard. Just going through here, like as part of verifying accuracy, you always want to do a visual check of your data too, because you can have noisy and inconsistent data. Here's some interesting path profiles that might make sense if you deal with LiDAR data, and might look like nothing if you don't. So this one up here is actually the top-down view where the color is set by scan angle. So that blue line is going to be directly underneath the drone where the laser was pointing straight down. So a scan angle of 0 degrees, because it was 0 degrees straight down. And as it goes up, it tilts up to higher scan angles as well, which is going to be the red. And what we see right here, this is then the profile. If you do a cross section over here, we can actually see there are two different flights that overlap, and they don't agree with one another, which is a very interesting thing. This is kind of a swath alignment, but it's not swath to swath. What this actually was an example of a improperly calibrated Lidar sensor, where this can actually be fixed by software as well, but basically at high scan angles, it was showing a little bit more noise in the data than we liked. One of those examples of just like having a trained technician to look at the data to be able to identify some of these things. This type of error, for the record, absolutely would also show up as error if you were doing an ISPLS like positional accuracy check. If you were using independent check shots, it would show up with this type of thing. But having a good just visual check is an important side to validating accuracy as well. Another word I often hear thrown around a lot, especially by like hardware manufacturers, is the concept of survey grade. Survey grade is not a formal definition. There is no such thing as survey grade, because there are some surveys that have been done with an accuracy of 10 feet, and those are still surveys, and those are good. But 10 feet is what they stated their accuracy to be, and that is what it is. And there are some surveys that require accuracy of considerably in excess of that. But there is no definition of what qualifies as survey grade. However, the industry has kind of coalesced, at least with drones, that typically that means you want to see it in that kind of 1 to 2/10 of a foot range. Again, that's not good enough for everything, but it's good enough for a lot of things. There are different ways that you can measure accuracy. Some of the older ways, like National Map Accuracy Standards, or even using a 95% confidence interval. Those aren't used as much anymore. In modern days, sometimes you see the RMSE of the GCP, of the ground control points themselves. This is actually not a good measure of accuracy, because if something was used to localize the project, if you use the ground control point to bring everything, like bring your project data to that ground control point, then of course it's going to be accurate. So what you actually want is to measure an RMSE of the root mean squared error of independent check shots. So that is, I'm simplifying a little, that is what the ISPLS positional accuracy standards measures. It's the RMSE of independent check shots. If that is all Greek to you, that's fine, but just make sure that when you are talking to someone that talks about accuracy, that they actually know what they're saying. When they say 1/10 of a foot, it's not, well, I took 2 shots in the field and they looked good, so that's great. I mean, I've talked to people using GPS before where they measure a point and their Trimble unit says, oh yeah, it's accurate to 3/1000. Cool. So, maybe not. Accuracy and precision, I'm just going to go through a lot of this stuff because there's more important stuff out here. Yeah, here are your accuracy classes. Again, if you want all this stuff is in the slide deck, so shoot me an email at the end if you want more of these, all of these slides about the actual certification of accuracy and the accuracy classes according to the ISPLS positional accuracy standards. Okay, let's now dive into some of the trickier parts, which are going to be things like point cloud classification. And you guys are all probably saying, great, he's going to tell us exactly the software and methodology to smoothly classify all the point clouds. And once again, I'm going to start with a much different question than you were probably expecting, which is the first step to point cloud classification is asking yourself if you even need to do it. And what you actually need to classify. Is it worth the time? This is a great example of a power line corridor with this beautifully classified point cloud of the actual power poles, the transmission lines, the distribution lines, the shield wires, and blah, blah, blah. And if you were just doing a topo survey of this, then that would be a massive waste of time and money. And it's the same thing with most LiDAR surveys. People will classify trees, high vegetation, low vegetation, buildings, foreign objects, power poles, power lines. And if it's a topo survey, you don't care about those things. You care about 2 classes, ground and not ground. That's it. For the majority of surveys, that is good enough. Now, you obviously need that in certain circumstances, but you need to start by asking yourself the question, what classes do I care about, and how do I get those ones together? Because otherwise, that's a huge time killer, is to try and classify every building when you don't care that whether it's a building or a tree or a car. It's not ground. You're trying to get topo out of it. Ground is what matters. So, asking yourself what classes you really need, is it worth it to take the time making this tree green and this building orange versus all of the ground, that sort of stuff, really matters. Point cloud classification is one of those things that is a mix between semi-automated and manual classification. The point cloud classification algorithms that are out there are rapidly advancing, which is very, very cool. This is one of those ones where the kind of machine learning side for filtering out what is a ground point versus a non-ground point is getting a lot better. It still requires a human in a loop, in our opinion, at least if you want to do something for a sealed survey. If you want something that's just kind of close, then maybe you can run it through an automatic algorithm, but typically for a survey, you want to have a human in the loop. As far as what classification software works, well, there are actually a lot out there. We have people that are specialized in all of these ones at different levels, and I can tell you, there is no magic bullet. Some are better at some things, some are worse than others. Some can handle bigger point clouds, some are better at manual classification, some have more powerful automatic classification algorithms. If I had one recommendation for what's the right point cloud classification or software to use, it's use whatever ecosystem you're already in and whatever you're already comfortable with. I've heard some people that absolutely swear by like a cyclone, and some people say, I die before I use like a cyclone. And you know what? I'm not here to judge. I know people that have been successful classifying and processing point clouds with all of these in the past. If I had to pick one or two, I'd probably say TerraSolid and Global Mapper are probably going to be the ones that I see the most success with. TerraSolid a little bit more efficient, Global Mapper a little bit more capability in terms of like different GIS type stuff you can do, but again, there's no magic bullet to this. So it takes time to manually classify a lot of these point clouds, and it takes a tech that kind of is experienced and has a decent workflow to be able to get through something in an efficient manner. The other thing to talk about is whether or not to thin your point clouds. This kind of goes to that point I was saying before is, it is no longer a problem to have too little data and not enough density. In fact, many of these point clouds are so incredibly dense that in order to work with them, you actually need to both thin and tile them to make it something that any normal computer can manage. And I say normal, this is another thing where if this is your problem, I promise you I have a point cloud data set that is bigger than any computer on this planet can handle. So it's not about buying a bigger computer, because the amount of data we can collect is so far outstripping the computer processing power. So one of the questions is to thin your point cloud. Realistically, this is drone dependent in terms of what data you need. I would just say if you are thinking of thinning your point clouds, be very, very careful. A lot of these smart point cloud thinning algorithms that are out there can actually introduce bias. So if you thin your point clouds, you really want to measure your accuracy after you thin the point clouds, not before, which I know goes a little bit out of my suggested workflow. But thinning point clouds can be a little bit tricky, so I usually prefer to work with full resolution point clouds. Computer hardware for point cloud and Lidar management, like with the before slides and with photogrammetry, more expensive computers unfortunately will probably not solve the problems you are facing. Better work, if you are having struggles working with point cloud data, buying a $10,000 computer probably isn't going to fix it. If you have a 6-year-old Lenovo potato laptop, then okay, yeah, you probably need a new computer. But if you've got something made within the last couple of years that is a reasonably powerful desktop, if you spend a couple grand on it, then it's going to be powerful enough, and it's the workflow you need to figure out. That said, once again, these are our recommendations for point cloud processors. They are slightly different specs than our photogrammetry PCs, because the hard drive and the single-threaded core CPU performance matters. So it's rare, again, it's kind of negligible differences here. This is what we would recommend for a computer. And once again, we're talking this is a couple $1,000 computer, not a $10,000 computer. But the workflow is much more important. As you are classifying point clouds, you once again have to always be aware that it is not perfect. There will still be gaps. This is actually a great example of an automated point cloud routine, and what you can see is there are a couple false positives and false negatives on here. So not only do you have some weird gray, which I believe was marked as noise, orange, which was marked as building, green as vegetation, and brown as the ground. The brown is pretty reliably ground there, but it's got some buildings and other stuff. Now there are ways to tweak a lot of these, and you can spend many hours trying to refine the automated point cloud classification routines, but sometimes it's faster to just run an automated one and then clean it up manually after having run it just once or twice. And this goes to where experience and a trained tech will be able to make those judgment calls very quickly. They'll be able to look at the site and say, okay, I'm not really gonna be able to use the automated routines to get that much better on this one. I guess I'm gonna go in and just start doing it manually. Versus someone that wants to do everything manually, which is probably not ideal, or everything automatic, which is also not ideal because you'll be tweaking the algorithms for forever and still not getting the end result. It's about finding that right balance between the automated routines and the manual ones. Yeah, creating it into a digital elevation model, I'll talk about that a little bit more. This is what like a digital elevation model looks like after it's been cleaned of vegetation. This is a cool one because you can see all of these tall trees, like 60-foot trees, and then when you cover it, this would be invisible to photogrammetry, and you can actually see the very precise creek bed there. And like I was saying, you can see like fallen logs underneath the tree. I think it's pretty cool, the accuracy that you can get once you actually dial in a lot of those ground classification algorithms properly. Another big challenge of a lot of these automated systems is defining what is ground actually kind of depends on context a lot of the time. For example, if you have a pile of debris, that either is ground or isn't ground, depending on the project or what you're measuring it for or what you actually care about. Or maybe you measure it as debris and maybe you interpolate a ground underneath it. There are just some judgment calls that often humans can do. Same thing with like stockpiles, right? If you call it ground or not ground, well, it depends on how you want to define it. It's clearly a stockpile, but if you want to define the ground as the surface of the dirt, then it would go over the top of the stockpile. But if it's for a volumetric calculation, then you need to create a surface underneath. Same thing with like rock outcroppings. Depending on the survey, that might need to be marked as its own thing, which is totally fine and valid. If you're doing construction, you gotta know where the rocks are at. Yeah, automatic ground classification is a little bit more technical than I probably have time for now as far as the different slope settings and how the actual triangulation and computation of ground actually works, but there are a lot of different settings that you can get into that. Grass and shrubs are another very interesting ones where basically you can set a kind of floor noise and expected angle and automatically classify everything above it as grass. And then the best way to do it is to actually, each one of these points, you can actually see there's a lot of noise in this point. You want to take the average of these points to create a surface because there is noise in point clouds, and that's where we'll get into the actual creation of a raster data from this point cloud thing coming up next, which is rasterizing point cloud data. So once you classify all of this, you still actually have noise. Point clouds, part of the reason they're called point clouds is because they are clouds. This is the profile view of a road. A road is asphalt. It is perfectly flat. What you actually see here is this Lidar data is very noisy. If you can actually look at the scale, what we're seeing here is about half a foot worth of noise between the top of this point cloud and the bottom of this point cloud. Now, a half a foot of noise might say, hey, that goes at odds with the fact that you said that you can get 0.2 of a foot accuracy. And that is absolutely true. Because what you actually do in part of point cloud processing is once you get your kind of ground points, you take a statistical average. And if you draw a line, I mean, any of you guys can see this. Humans are so good at seeing these sorts of patterns, right? If you drew a line directly along the middle of that point cloud, it would be considerably more accurate than any individual point in the point cloud. This is where the kind of messiness of statistics comes in. There is noise in a point cloud, but that noise averages out, and you can actually utilize the noise of the point cloud and these points, simplify it down, create a smoothed out surface that averages a lot of these points, and it gets you a more accurate data, a more accurate surface than the point cloud itself. In a point cloud, every single point is not, you shouldn't view it as an actual thing that exists. You should view it as a like almost statistical uncertainty, a probabilistic point, which again, I know that's really hard for people that don't love statistics, but that's kind of the way that it works. So when you rasterize something, you're actually taking the vector data, you're taking like the lines, the points, which can be anywhere, and you're converting them into a grid, like an image with pixels is the best way to think about it. So again, vector data kind of starts looking something like this. Rasterizing it, you would obviously do it at higher resolution, would make it look again something like this. Raster datas are going to be your orthophotos, DEMs, DSMs. We are big fans of creating digital surface models rasterized off of the point cloud. This is going to be your raw profile. This is going to be if you created a raster data without doing very much averaging. And this would be if you created a raster surface with averaging. This raster surface with averaging right here is statistically way, way, way more accurate than the rest of them. So not only does this actually make a point cloud into a much more useful format, but it also increases your accuracy when you are creating that raster data. And so then from there, you convert your point cloud to a raster grid. Once you have a raster grid, you can simplify it even further by adding additional points and polylines to create it into a tin surface, which then goes into CAD. So you have your raster surface, convert it to points and polylines, and get it into CAD. Here are just some cool imageries. This is the ortho photo of an actual project as well. You can see super dense vegetation, a little bit of the stream, and here's that same thing where once again you can see like the crown of the trees, fallen trees, and the tire truck ruts in the road from where a truck drove through. This is the level of this is kind of what a raster data would look like before cleaning it out too much. All right, we are wrapping up. So as far as extracting features go, this is something we call line work drafting. We have actually other videos about this. If you want to see those, go ahead and send me an email. I'd be more than happy to share a lot of our resources on some of the ways to draft line work. But the short answer is, like other things, there's no magic bullet to this. It actually takes a lot of human time to actually draft things. Having good CAD drafting standards and good workflows and procedures will help get you there. And putting it all in CAD should be something that honestly you guys know a lot more about than me. I'm just the photogrammetry and Lidar guy. I'm not even the CAD guy in our office. There are people that know a heck of a lot more than that for me, than I do. Creating it in CAD, making it useful, adding in your imagery at the step too. We're big fans of putting in CAD-friendly imagery and everything. It's such a useful part of the drone that you no longer have to rely on just the GPS data. Having imagery backing it in a format that is useful to you and actually small enough that people can use it and still email the files is really important. To create a final survey that should look the same, whether it's made conventionally with a drone, via LiDAR, via whatever, you should probably put what tools you used in the notes of the survey, but the final survey should look pretty much the same depending on how you use it. All right. So hopefully this is useful to actually help you guys get a drone program that you will use, that will save you time, and will get you better data. Because I can promise you that it absolutely is doable. There are a lot of pitfalls on the way, and hopefully I can help you avoid some of those either through this presentation or in the future. Starting with making sure you pick the right tool for the job, using a complete workflow that you know in advance, and of course, if you want any help, this is what we do for a living. If you're curious about hardware, we do drone data processing and that sort of stuff. So if you would like a copy of the slides and presentations or have any questions, there's my email address. That's the code to actually get the video and the recording and the slides and all of that. And thank you so much for spending your Friday afternoon with me. I appreciate it.